What would you do if the person you publicly humiliated turned out to be the most brilliant mind in your entire industry? At 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, Victoria Langford's $4.2 million production line went completely silent, and her empire started bleeding money by the minute. She needed a miracle. What walked through her factory door instead was a tired man in grease-stained boots carrying a second-hand toolbox. She laughed. Her executives laughed. Nobody's laughing now. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit like and stay until the very end. This one's worth it. The machines died at 11:47 p.m. Not gradually, not with warning sounds or flickering lights, or the polite mechanical coughing that usually preceded a shutdown. One moment, the floor of Blackstone Manufacturing was its normal self, a thunderous, vibrating cathedral of steel and motion, 300 workers moving between massive hydraulic presses and precision assembly lines, forklifts weaving paths through organized chaos, the air thick with the smell of coolant fluid and hot metal. And then, in the space of a single breath, everything stopped. The silence hit like a physical thing. Marcus Webb, the night shift supervisor, was standing near line 7 with a clipboard and a cup of terrible vending machine coffee when it happened. He described it later as the kind of quiet that makes your stomach drop before your brain even catches up. He stood there for a full 3 seconds, blinking before the first alarm started screaming, then a second alarm, then 7 more. By midnight, the situation had been assessed. The primary production line, the spine of the entire facility, responsible for roughly 60% of nightly output, had gone completely dark. Not a partial failure, not a localized malfunction in a single unit or sector. The whole thing. 430 meters of interconnected machinery, from the raw material intake at the north end of the building all the way to the finished goods inspection stations near the loading docks, had simply stopped existing as a functional system. The financial damage was already being calculated in real time on a screen in the operations center. At Blackstone's current production rates and contract obligations, every hour of downtime on that line cost approximately $340,000. That number was not a rough estimate. It was precise, because someone with a spreadsheet and too much anxiety had already built a formula for exactly this kind of nightmare. Marcus stared at it for a moment, then picked up his phone and called the only person he was required to call when something like this happened. Victoria Langford answered on the second ring. She always answered on the second ring. Didn't matter if it was 3 in the afternoon or 3 in the morning. People in her company had theories about it, that she never actually slept, that she had some kind of supernatural awareness of when her phone was about to ring, that she simply refused to be the kind of person who took 3 or 4 rings to answer because, in her worldview, taking 4 rings to answer a call was the first step toward losing. "Talk to me," she said. Marcus talked. He gave her the facts, the timeline, the scope, the current status, the preliminary assessment from the floor team. He was precise and calm, because Marcus Webb had learned early in his career at Blackstone that Victoria Langford had exactly 0 patience for panic. She could handle bad news. She couldn't handle people delivering bad news badly. When he finished, there was a pause. "Who have you called?" she asked. "Meridian Industrial Services. They're our primary maintenance contractor." "I know who Meridian is, Marcus. What did they say?" He exhaled slowly. "They said minimum 72 hours before they can even begin diagnostic assessment. They've got teams committed to 2 other sites right now. They offered to—" 72 hours? She said it flatly, like she was reading something off a page she found offensive. "Yes. That's over $1 million in downtime before they even pick up a wrench." "I know." Another pause, shorter this time. "What about Apex Technical?" "Already called them. They quoted 4 to 5 days, said a failure of this scope." "Who's the third?" He'd already dialed them. Castellan Engineering. The big firms, the recognized names, the contractors with the glossy websites, and the professional account managers who sent Christmas cards. All of them had said essentially the same thing in different fonts. "This is complicated, we're busy, it'll take time, it'll cost more than you want to pay." Victoria listened to him explain all of this without interrupting. That was unusual. Victoria almost always interrupted. When he was done, she said, So you're telling me that every major contractor in the region has looked at this situation and decided that the best they can offer me is 4 to 5 days of silence and a very large invoice? That's essentially correct. And in those 4 to 5 days, I lose. He heard something in the background, the soft click of a keyboard. She was running numbers herself. Somewhere between $1.4 and $1.7 million, depending on penalty clauses with Eastern Consolidated. He hadn't even gotten to the Eastern Consolidated angle yet. He was briefly impressed and mostly terrified. Yes, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, who do you think can fix this? The question surprised him. Victoria Langford did not typically ask for opinions from floor supervisors at midnight. She issued directives. She made decisions. She operated on the assumption that she was the smartest person in most rooms she entered, which was irritating and also, Marcus had reluctantly concluded over 7 years, frequently accurate. But she'd asked. And Marcus had been thinking about this since the moment the alarms started. "There's a guy," he said carefully. "Local. He's not what you'd expect. He runs a small shop on the east side of town. Carter's Mechanical. But before that he was... Is he certified?" "He's more than certified. He has a background in... Can he fix what's broken on my production line?" Marcus thought about the 3 times in the past 2 years that Carter's Mechanical had handled jobs that the big contractors had either botched or refused to touch. He thought about a specific afternoon 18 months ago when a hydraulic calibration problem on a secondary press had stumped Meridian's senior technician for 6 hours, and Ethan Carter had driven over, looked at it for 20 minutes, and had it running inside of 2. "Yes," Marcus said, "I think he can." Another pause, longer. "Fine," Victoria said. "Get him here, now." Getting Ethan Carter here now turned out to be slightly more complicated than the phrase suggested. Marcus had the number for Carter's Mechanical saved in his personal phone, not in the official Blackstone vendor database, because Ethan didn't exactly appear in official vendor databases the way Meridian Industrial Services did. He was the kind of resource that experienced plant supervisors kept in their personal contacts and mentioned quietly to each other, like a good mechanic or a reliable babysitter. Word of mouth. Old-fashioned. The phone rang 4 times before a voice answered. Not groggy exactly, but not wide awake either. The voice of someone who'd learned to sleep lightly. "Carter. Ethan. It's Marcus Webb over at Blackstone. We've got a situation." A brief pause. "What kind of situation?" "Primary production line, full shutdown. We can't get any of the big contractors out here for at least 72 hours. Another pause, this one with a different quality. "How long has it been down?" "About 40 minutes. What's the last thing that happened before shutdown? Did it go gradually or all at once?" "All at once. 1 second running, next second nothing." Marcus could hear something on the other end of the line. Movement. The soft sounds of a space being navigated in the dark. "I've got my daughter here," Ethan said. It wasn't an excuse. It was information. "I understand if... My neighbor, Sandra. She watches Lily sometimes when I have to go out late." More movement. A door. "Give me 40 minutes." He arrived in 53. The truck that pulled through Blackstone's main security gate was a 2009 Ford F-150 in a color that had probably been called silver at the dealership and was now better described as experienced. One of the side mirrors had been replaced at some point with a different one that didn't quite match. The bed held a collection of equipment cases and toolboxes that were clean and organized in a way that the truck's exterior made easy to overlook. Ethan Carter stepped out, and Marcus, who'd been waiting in the parking lot, did a quick inventory the way you inevitably did when meeting someone you'd talked up to your boss. 32 years old, medium height, the kind of build that came from actual physical work rather than a gym. Dark hair that needed a cut. A face that looked like it had done a fair amount of not sleeping lately. He was wearing a canvas jacket over a Henley shirt and work pants, and his boots were the kind that had been resoled at least once. He moved with the economy of motion that Marcus had come to associate with people who were genuinely competent. No wasted gestures, no performance of confidence. He was carrying a single toolbox, and a worn leather case that Marcus had learned over time contained diagnostic equipment that cost considerably more than the truck transporting it. Marcus, he said, extending a hand. Thanks for coming. I know it's late. Where's the main control interface? Direct. No preamble. Marcus liked that. He didn't get a chance to respond because at that moment 3 things happened in quick succession. A sleek black SUV pulled into the parking lot. 2 men in expensive suits got out of the back. And then the passenger door opened and Victoria Langford stepped out. She was not what first-time observers typically expected. Victoria Langford, at 30, was 2 inches shorter than average, with dark brown hair pulled back practically, and the kind of controlled energy that made you immediately aware of her presence in a space. She was dressed for a board meeting despite it being well past midnight, which said something about either her habits or her intentions, and her expression as she took in the parking lot scene was the expression of someone who had been interrupted and was prepared to be displeased about it. Her eyes moved to Ethan's truck, then to Ethan. Something shifted in her face. It was quick, and she controlled it fast, but Marcus, who'd been watching people in this company for 7 years, caught it. It was dismissal, instant and complete. She walked over to where they were standing, and Marcus said, Ms. Langford, this is Ethan Carter, from Carter's Mechanical. Is this the repair service? She wasn't looking at Ethan when she said it. She was looking at her phone. Ethan said, I'm Ethan Carter. I work on industrial systems. She looked up at that, took him in briefly the way you'd take in a piece of furniture you weren't sure would fit the room, and said, Fine. Marcus will show you in. She turned to one of the suited men. Get Meridian back on the phone. I want them to tell me in their own words why they can't have anyone here in under 72 hours. She walked toward the building without another word. One of the executives, a man with a name that Marcus could never remember, something with a K, Kevin or Kenneth, fell into step beside Ethan and said in the tone of someone who wasn't being deliberately rude but was about to be anyway, You're familiar with Blackstone's systems? Because this isn't a small job. This is precision industrial equipment, not, what's the last maintenance record on the primary line's electrical junction panels? Ethan asked. The man blinked. That would be in the maintenance logs. When did they last run a full diagnostic on the transformer relay network? Silence. Do you have those records accessible? I'd have to check. That's okay, Ethan said. He wasn't being unkind. He was already done with the conversation. I'll figure it out once I see the system. The production floor at Full Stop was an unsettling place. Marcus had worked at Blackstone for almost a decade, and he'd never seen it like this. The massive machines sitting inert, the overhead lights on their emergency setting casting everything in slightly wrong shadows, 300 workers standing in clusters or sitting on equipment, waiting. Security staff had already begun directing non-essential personnel to the break rooms, but there were still a lot of people on the floor, and they all watched as Marcus led Ethan through the main doors. Ethan stopped just inside the entrance. He didn't pull out equipment. He didn't consult a tablet or make a phone call. He just stood there for a moment, looking at the line. His eyes moved slowly, left to right, taking in the full length of it. Marcus had seen this before with Ethan, and it still struck him as slightly uncanny. Most technicians came in with a plan, a checklist, a series of diagnostic steps they'd run in sequence. Ethan came in and looked, like he was listening to something the machines were saying in their silence. Walk me through it from the intake end, Ethan said. They walked. Ethan said very little. He crouched twice to look at cable routing under panel bases. He spent 3 minutes at the central control station, not touching anything, just reading the fault codes on the screen with the same focused attention you'd give a letter with bad news. He looked at the transformer array in the subfloor access corridor for a long time. When they came back to roughly the center of the line, he straightened up and said, Your J-Series junction relay panel, the secondary bank, on the east side of the main control cluster. When was the last time anyone physically inspected the bus bars in that section? Marcus pulled out his phone and started scrolling through the digital maintenance log. He scrolled for a while. Then he scrolled back. Then forward again. I'm not finding a record of that specific inspection, he said slowly. That's because it hasn't been done, Ethan said. Not accusatory, just stating a fact. The automated system wouldn't flag it because the panel's diagnostics report is normal. But there's a design characteristic in this model of relay panel. It's a known issue. not widely documented, specific to the J7 series manufactured before a 2019 design revision, where the thermal expansion coefficients of the bus bar assembly and the housing material create microfractures that sustained high load over time. He paused. Your line has been running above design capacity for how long? Marcus stared at him. We increased output targets about 14 months ago. Ethan nodded like that confirmed what he'd expected. That's probably when the fracturing accelerated. At some point tonight, my guess is during a peak load cycle, the fracture propagated to the point where one of the bus bar contacts failed. That's not just a localized failure. That relay panel is the master distribution point for the secondary control network, which is why the whole line went dark instead of just a section. He looked at Marcus. I need to get into that panel. Can you fix it? He considered for a moment, the honest consideration of someone who didn't make promises without running the numbers first. If the panel housing is structurally intact and the fracture hasn't bridged across to adjacent contacts, yes, I can fabricate a replacement bus bar assembly tonight using components I have in the truck and what I can source from your parts inventory if you have one. He paused. If the damage is more extensive, we're looking at a longer timeline, but still well under what your contractors quoted. Marcus exhaled. What do you need? Access to the panel, your parts inventory location, a list of what's in there if you have it, and somewhere I can work that's not in the middle of the floor. Victoria was in the operations center, which was a glass-walled room elevated above the production floor, when her assistant Devin materialized at her elbow. The repair technician is working on the East Control Cluster, Devin said. Victoria looked through the glass at the floor below, where she could see at some distance a figure crouched near one of the large panel assemblies in the center of the line. She watched for a moment. He appeared to be working by hand, which for some reason struck her as strange, though she couldn't have immediately articulated why. What's his assessment? She asked. Supervisor Webb says he's identified a specific relay panel issue, something about bus bar fracturing. Is that plausible? Devin hesitated. I've sent the fault codes to Meridian's technical team and asked them to comment. What did they say? That they'd need to physically inspect the system before making any assessment. Victoria returned to her laptop. 3 screens in the operations center were running continuous financial modeling, downtime costs, contract penalty projections, revised shipping timelines for Eastern Consolidated. The numbers were accumulating with the quiet patience of a meter running. What's his timeline? She asked. He hasn't given one. She looked back through the glass. The figure hadn't moved much, still crouched, still apparently working with hands and what looked like standard tools. One of the K-named executives came in, Kevin, she was almost sure it was Kevin, and said, for what it's worth, I looked up Carter's Mechanical. They're registered in the county, operational for about 3 years, 2 full-time employees listed. He does mostly HVAC repairs, some industrial maintenance work, smaller facilities. He paused meaningfully. Nothing at this scale. Victoria processed this information. Marcus Webb recommended him specifically, she said. Marcus is a good supervisor, but he's not. If he's wrong, we'll deal with it. How much time have we wasted calling contractors tonight? Kevin didn't have an immediate answer for that. Let him work, she said. The panel was worse than Ethan had described to Marcus, and slightly better than his private worst-case projection. He'd opened the J7 junction relay housing and found exactly what he'd suspected, a fracture in the primary bus bar assembly that had propagated approximately 2.3 centimeters and resulted in a contact failure at junction point 4. The secondary contact point was showing early-stage stress fracturing. The housing itself was intact. He sat on the floor next to the open panel, his toolbox organized around him the way his workbench at the shop was organized, and began working through the math for the replacement assembly. There was a calmness to this kind of work that he'd tried to explain to people a few times and mostly given up on. When a machine was broken, the problem was finite. It had a cause and it had a solution, and the space between those two things was just physics and time. He found that calming in a way that very little else was. Lily had asked him once why he liked fixing things. She'd been 5, and she'd been watching him repair a neighbor's lawnmower in the driveway, and she'd gotten that look she sometimes got where you could practically see the question forming before it came out. Daddy, why do you like fixing broken stuff? He'd thought about it genuinely, the way he always tried to with her questions, rather than giving the reflexive adult answer that was easier but less true. Because broken things make sense, he'd told her. They just need someone to pay attention. She'd thought about this for a moment, then gone back to her juice. He got back to work. The bus bar replacement took 2 hours and 40 minutes, including the time spent fabricating the primary component from stock material he sourced from Blackstone's own parts inventory. They had the raw material, they just hadn't known they needed it, or why. He rebuilt the contact point, checked and double-checked the alignment against the housing specifications, and replaced the secondary assembly with a proper industrial-grade component from his own kit. He also, while he was in there, tagged the early-stage fracture in the secondary contact for Marcus's records. Not his job, technically, but leaving it unaddressed would mean being back here in 6 months for the same conversation. At 4:23 a.m., he powered up the junction relay panel. The control network came back online. At 4:31 a.m., after running a diagnostic sequence on the secondary systems, Ethan stood up, stretched his back with a grimace that was a reminder of a long-ago incident involving a falling equipment housing and his spine, and walked to the mainline control station. He checked the readings, ran the startup sequence, watched the fault code display. Clear. He restarted line 1. The machines came back to life with a sound that was, objectively, just mechanical equipment resuming operation. Metal and hydraulics and motors doing what they were designed to do. But the workers who'd been waiting on the floor, the ones who hadn't gone to break rooms, who'd been sitting on equipment or leaning against walls, exhausted and anxious at 4 in the morning, straightened up as the sound hit them. One woman near the south end of the line actually put her hand over her mouth. A man 3 stations down let out a breath that sounded like something physical leaving his body. Marcus Webb, who had been in the operations center drinking his 4th cup of bad vending machine coffee, looked through the glass and saw the line moving and said something quietly that probably wasn't appropriate for a professional environment and didn't care at all. Ethan walked back to the junction panel, closed and secured the housing, and began repacking his toolbox. The operations center had been a tense space for 4.5 hours. When the production floor came back to life, the tension broke in an interesting way, not with relief exactly, but with the slightly manic energy of people who'd been holding something very tightly and were now putting it down. Someone printed the updated financial projections. The damage was real. 4.5 hours of downtime on the primary line, approximately $1.53 million at standard rates, though actual penalty exposure with Eastern Consolidated would depend on shipping adjustments still being calculated. Bad, but not catastrophic. Victoria stood at the window looking at the restarted line for a long moment. Then she turned to Devin and said, "Get me a full accounting of what the contractors quoted us and what this actually cost." Devin said, "Of course. Also, the repair technician is repacking his tools. Do you want to speak with him before he leaves?" She hadn't thought about that. In the rush of numbers and projections and phone calls, she'd essentially stopped thinking about Ethan Carter as a person in the building and started thinking about him as a variable in a cost equation. "Send Marcus to coordinate payment with him," she said. Devin looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of someone who had an opinion and had learned when to offer it. "What?" Victoria said. "He fixed it in 4 hours and 31 minutes, Devin said carefully. Every major contractor in the region said minimum 3 days. "I know that. He was alone on the floor the entire time. He fabricated a component from materials in our own parts inventory that our maintenance team didn't know we had or that we'd need." Devin, "I'm just noting that the person who just saved us from a potential $2 million loss is currently repacking his toolbox by himself on the floor." Victoria looked back through the glass. She could see, distantly, the figure near the center of the line, efficiently organizing equipment into cases with no particular urgency, no performance of waiting to be acknowledged. "Fine," she said. "I'll go down." She found him just as he was lifting the main toolbox. He straightened when she approached, which put them at roughly equal eye level, and there was a moment where she had the slightly uncomfortable awareness that she had no prepared version of this conversation. Victoria Langford almost always had a prepared version of conversations. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Ms. Langford. The line is running." "Yes." He wasn't being curt. He was simply confirming the observable fact. Our contractors quoted us 3 to 5 days for a job you completed in under 5 hours. She paused. I want to understand how that's possible. He seemed to think about whether the question was genuine, apparently decided it was. The failure was specific, he said. Once you identify the specific failure, the solution is also specific. I've seen the J7 bus bar issue before in a different facility. Most people haven't, and the diagnostic software doesn't flag it because the panel self-reports as nominal until the moment it fails. He paused. Your contractors aren't incompetent. They're running general diagnostic protocols for a problem they haven't seen before. That takes time. And you knew what it was immediately? I had a strong theory within the first 15 minutes. The rest of the time was confirming it and doing the work. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Around them, the production floor was operating at full capacity. The sound of it was enormous after hours of silence. What did we pay you? She asked. She hadn't actually checked the number yet. Standard commercial rate for after-hours emergency industrial work. Marcus negotiated fair terms. A pause. And I flagged a secondary issue in the same panel housing, early-stage stress fracture on the backup contact assembly. It's documented in the repair record Marcus has. It's not urgent, but it should be addressed in the next service cycle. She hadn't known about that. She'd been in the operations center watching numbers while he'd apparently been doing something more thorough than what he'd been hired to do. Why would you flag additional issues? You weren't asked to. He looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read exactly. Not offended, not performing patience, just a look that suggested he found the question slightly puzzling. Because it's there, he said. Leaving it unflagged doesn't benefit you. She opened her mouth to say something. She wasn't entirely sure what. And then Kevin appeared at her elbow with a phone and a pressing expression and said, Ms. Langford, Eastern Consolidated's logistics manager is on the line. They need confirmation. She took the phone. By the time she'd resolved the immediate shipping logistics, Ethan Carter was gone. He drove home through the city at 5:15 in the morning with the windows down because the heater in the F-150 worked fine, but he needed the cold air to stay awake. The job had been, he thought about the word. Satisfying wasn't quite it. Satisfying implied he'd been anxious beforehand, which wasn't accurate. It had been clean. That was the word. A clean job, a specific problem with a specific solution, well executed. He was tired in the good way, the way that meant sleep would come easily when he finally got horizontal. He thought about Lily, who would be up in a few hours. She was with Sandra next door, but he'd need to get her settled before the school routine started. She had a Wednesday thing where she needed her specific water bottle, the one with the dolphins on it, and it had to be cold water, not room temperature water. And if he got the temperature wrong, there would be a detailed explanation of exactly why that was incorrect. He smiled at the road. The city was doing that early morning thing where it was both completely empty and quietly alive at the same time. A garbage truck 3 blocks over, a 24-hour diner with lights on and 2 people inside, the particular gray of pre-dawn light on building fronts. He turned onto his street, parked in front of the small house that still somehow surprised him every time. He'd grown up in apartments, and the house felt like a statement about something, though he wasn't always sure what. The front porch had a swing he'd been meaning to fix for 6 months. A pair of Lily's rain boots sat next to the door where she'd left them 2 days ago. He sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off. The Blackstone job was done. He'd send the complete repair documentation and secondary issue report to Marcus in the morning. He'd file the paperwork, handle the invoice, move on. In the front seat passenger footwell was the old leather portfolio he sometimes brought to jobs because it contained notes. And in those notes was something he'd been working on, in the spare hours and late nights, for about 18 months. A detailed engineering analysis of the Harland mill facility on the south side. The abandoned factory that everyone in the industrial sector referred to in the past tense. He'd been to that building 11 times. He'd walked every level, taken measurements, photographed the infrastructure, pulled historical records from the county planning department and the original construction specifications from a 2003 building permit that had never been fully executed. He'd run the numbers on material costs, on retrofit feasibility, on projected operational efficiency once the facility was restored. The numbers were extraordinary. not in a loose, optimistic sense, in a concrete, defensible engineering sense. He left the portfolio in the truck, went inside, checked on Lily briefly. She was asleep on Sandra's couch with a stuffed elephant under her arm. Then went to his own room and was unconscious within minutes. The alarm would go off at 7:15. He'd deal with the Blackstone invoice. He'd deal with Sandra. He'd deal with the dolphin water bottle. And then he'd go back to the numbers that had been living in his head for a year and a half, and he'd figure out what to do with them. The morning after the Blackstone incident played out differently depending on who you were. For Marcus Webb, it played out as a conversation with his direct supervisor that involved the phrases, "How was this allowed to deteriorate?" and "Why wasn't this in our maintenance schedule?" Neither of which were technically Marcus's fault, but which were going to become his responsibility to document anyway. For Devon, Victoria's assistant, it played out as a research exercise. She'd made a note during the night. The phrase J7 bus bar issue that Ethan had mentioned, and the way he'd said he'd seen it before. She pulled up the maintenance records for Carter's Mechanical through the county business registry. Clean record, 3 years operational, solid reviews from the limited client base she could find. But the business itself told only so much. She made a few more calls. For Victoria Langford, the morning after played out as a board call at 8 a.m., then a session with legal regarding the Eastern Consolidated contract adjustments, then a review of the full financial damage from the downtime, and at some point in the early afternoon, a conversation with Kevin, who she had confirmed was Kevin, last name Marsh, in which Kevin said something that she would think about for considerably longer than she expected. "The Carter repair," Kevin said, going through the incident cost analysis. Total invoice came out to, he looked at his tablet, $14,200. Victoria looked at him. For a 4.5-hour job that saved you from, he consulted another number, approximately $1.8 million in combined downtime costs and contract penalties. She was aware of this. Meridian's emergency call-out fee alone would have been $22,000, Kevin continued, before anyone touched a tool. Kevin, I'm just noting the delta. Note it in the report and move on. He moved on, but the number sat with her. Not because it was wrong, because it was precisely right, and it pointed at something she hadn't fully processed in the scramble of the previous night. The man in the grease-stained boots with the second-hand truck had just demonstrated a level of technical competence that her highest-tier contractors couldn't match at any price, identified a secondary failure that her own maintenance team hadn't caught, documented it for her benefit without being asked, and charged her a rate that she would have described, if she were being entirely honest, as almost aggressively fair. And her first reaction upon seeing him in the parking lot had been to not look at him directly. She filed this thought in the part of her brain reserved for things she would examine later, closed the Blackstone incident file, and moved on to the rest of the day. 3 weeks later, Victoria Langford attended an industry roundtable at the Regional Manufacturing Association's quarterly dinner. She sat at the main table with the other significant figures in the sector. People she knew well, competitors she respected, and some she didn't. 2 politicians who showed up to these things because the photo opportunities were reliable. At some point in the after-dinner part of the evening, the conversation moved, the way it inevitably did in these circles, toward the topic of the Harland mill. "It's a white elephant at this point," said a man named Douglas Presser, who ran the second-largest precision manufacturing operation in the region. "I had engineers look at it 2 years ago. Structural remediation alone would cost—" "The infrastructure is sound," said someone on the other side of the table. "The electrical grid integration is a complete overhaul. The footprint is exceptional, though," someone else offered. "If you could solve the infrastructure problem." Nobody can solve the infrastructure problem at a viable cost basis. That's the whole issue. Victoria had heard versions of this conversation before. The Harland mill was a running argument in the regional manufacturing sector, the way certain properties became arguments. Too good to demolish, too expensive to restore, too complicated to ignore. "I heard someone's been running surveys at the site," Douglas said. "Independent engineer, apparently. Some local guy." Victoria looked up from her wine glass. "Who?" she asked. Douglas shrugged. "Nobody I recognized. One of the county planning people mentioned it. Apparently he's been in the building permit records too, pulling historical specs." He shook his head with the mild amusement of someone watching a person attempt something quixotic. Good luck to him. That building needs a miracle. Victoria didn't say anything else about it, but on the drive home, she asked Devin, who was in the front seat reviewing the next day's schedule, find out who's been running independent surveys at the Harland Mill property. Start with the county planning department. Devin said, any particular reason? Victoria looked out the window at the city going by. Just curious, she said. Ethan Carter had been to the county planning office 8 times in 11 months. And by the 3rd visit, the woman at the records desk had started pulling his file before he reached the counter. Her name was Janet, and she had the particular energy of someone who'd spent 20 years watching people come in with plans and ambitions and leave with permission slips or rejection letters, and had made her peace with the whole business of human optimism. She looked at Ethan the way she looked at all of them, with professional neutrality that occasionally cracked into something warmer when she thought no one was watching. On his 8th visit, she slid the requested specs across the counter and said, you know, most people who pull historical records for a site this many times are either planning to buy it or planning to write a book about it. Ethan took the folder. Or they just want to understand what they're looking at before they decide. Janet looked at him over her reading glasses. And have you decided? He thought about this seriously because the question deserved it. Getting there, he said. He drove to the Harland Mill afterward. He did this sometimes, not for any specific task, but just to stand in the space and run the numbers again in his head against the physical reality of the building. Engineering analysis was one thing on paper. Standing inside a structure, feeling the actual quality of the floor under your feet, and looking at the actual state of the support columns was another. The Harland Mill was 3 stories, 180,000 square feet, built in 1974 on a lot that had excellent infrastructure access, rail siding, road access on 2 sides, within a mile of the regional power substation. It had operated as a metalworking facility through the 1990s and had been empty for almost 20 years. The county had tried to sell it twice and failed both times because the price was too high for what most buyers could do with it and too low for what it would cost to restore. Most buyers. Ethan walked the 2nd floor, the way he always did, letting the numbers run. The structural condition was better than the official assessment suggested. The 2018 county engineering report had been based on visual inspection without core sampling, and the visible deterioration on the facade had affected the assessment more than the actual foundation and structural elements warranted. He'd core sampled at 3 points. The concrete was sound. The electrical integration was a problem, but a solvable one. He'd designed a phased approach, the kind of approach that was genuinely innovative, not just rearranging standard solutions, but a specific configuration of modern microgrid integration with the regional substation that his calculations suggested would reduce implementation costs by about 38% compared to conventional restoration. His phone buzzed. Lily's school, confirming tomorrow's parent event. He noted it in his calendar app, which was color-coded in a system that Lily had helped design when she was 5 and that he'd never modified, partly because it worked and partly because changing it felt like erasing something. He stood at the 2nd floor east window, which looked out over the rail siding and the open land beyond it, and thought about what it would mean to get this wrong. He had a repair shop. It employed 2 people, himself and Roberto, who'd been his first hire and who had a family and a mortgage. The shop was profitable, modest, reliable. Lily had a school she liked and a room with a mural on the wall that he'd painted himself, slightly crooked in one corner because he'd run out of wall at an awkward angle. Getting the Harland Mill wrong would not be a contained failure. He stayed at the window longer than he usually did. Then he went back to his truck, drove to the school, picked up the parent event details, drove to the shop, checked in with Roberto on 2 open jobs, revised his purchase price analysis for the 4th time using updated material cost data, and sent the revised file to his attorney with a note that said, ready to move forward. 6 weeks after the midnight repair at Blackstone, Marcus Webb sent a text to his personal contacts list that said, line's been running clean. 2nd panel issue he flagged got addressed last week. Contractor said the flagged failure would have taken us down within 45 to 60 days, just so you know. Ethan read this on his phone during his lunch break, which he was eating at his desk at the shop because Roberto had a dentist appointment and someone needed to be available for walk-ins. He texted back, Good. Glad it got addressed. Marcus replied, You ever in the market for a long-term maintenance contract? Asking for a friend who is me. Ethan thought about the Harland Mill acquisition, which was in final due diligence. He thought about what the next 18 months were going to look like if the numbers held. He texted, Ask me again in a year. He finished his lunch, a sandwich he'd made that morning that had gotten slightly worse for sitting in a bag for 4 hours, and went back to the fabrication drawings he was reviewing for a client's custom component order. Outside the shop window, the east side of the city went about its business. A truck from a food distributor made a delivery to the diner across the street. 2 kids on bicycles cut through the parking lot. An older man with a coffee walked a dog that appeared to have strong opinions about a particular fire hydrant. Ethan Carter, 1 month away from finalizing the purchase of the Harland Mill facility, sitting in a modest repair shop he'd built from 3 years of grinding work, eating a slightly stale sandwich at a cluttered desk, looked at the fabrication drawings and felt the precise and specific satisfaction of knowing exactly what he was doing and why. The machines don't care who fixes them. They just care if you know how. The purchase agreement for the Harland Mill property closed on a Thursday afternoon in a conference room that smelled like old carpet and printer toner, with Ethan's attorney Linda Cho across the table from the county's asset disposition representative, and a notary who kept checking her phone between signatures. It was not a glamorous transaction. There were no champagne toasts, no handshakes in front of cameras, no moment where anyone paused to acknowledge that something significant was happening. Linda slid documents across the table. The county rep initialed where required, Ethan signed where indicated, and then it was done. The Harland Mill, 180,000 square feet of empty industrial space that the regional manufacturing sector had collectively written off as a cautionary tale, belonged to Ethan Carter, doing business as Carter Industrial LLC, a company he had incorporated 4 months earlier with a registered address that was currently his repair shop. Linda gathered the documents into her briefcase and said, in the parking lot afterward, You know, I have to ask one more time. Linda, I'm your attorney. Asking uncomfortable questions is the job. I know what I'm doing. She looked at him over the roof of her car. Linda Cho was 61 years old, had been practicing business law for 34 of those years, and had seen enough people walk confidently into financially catastrophic decisions that she'd developed a finely tuned instinct for the difference between real confidence and the kind that was mostly volume. I believe you, she said. That's actually the part that concerns me. He drove back to the shop with the signed copies on the passenger seat and called Roberto on the way to let him know he'd be in late. Roberto, who had been with Ethan since the shop's 2nd month, and who had come to understand that Ethan's definition of late generally meant after completing 2 things he didn't mention earlier, said fine and asked if they were still doing the hydraulic line replacement on the Grover transport truck before noon. They were. Ethan got back to the shop at 11:14, changed his clothes in the bathroom. He kept a set of work clothes at the shop for exactly this kind of day, and was under the truck by 11:20. Roberto handed him a wrench without being asked and said, So did it go through? Signed and recorded. Roberto was quiet for a moment. My brother-in-law thinks you're either a genius or insane. What do you think? Roberto considered this from where he was crouching by the front axle. He was 43, broad-shouldered, had been doing mechanical work since he was 15, and was one of the most technically steady people Ethan had ever worked with. He was not a man who offered opinions carelessly. I think the numbers you showed me were real, Roberto said, and I think if they're real, you know what you're doing. He passed Ethan a different wrench. I also think if it goes wrong, you're going to lose the shop to cover the debt. I know. Does Lily know? Ethan didn't answer immediately. The hydraulic line was corroded at the second coupling point, which was going to add 20 minutes to the job. He worked around it. She knows I bought a building, he said. She asked if it was bigger than our house, and I said yes, and she wanted to know if we could put a pool in it. Roberto made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Smart kid. She is. They worked in silence for a while, the comfortable silence of 2 people who'd spent enough hours in similar positions that communication had largely migrated to the nonverbal. Outside the shop's open bay door, the east side of the city did its late morning thing. Delivery trucks, A school bus making a wrong turn and correcting itself, the woman from the bakery 2 doors down sweeping her section of sidewalk with the aggressive precision of someone who had opinions about debris. The Harland Mill acquisition, Ethan knew, was only the first step. The harder part was what came next. The renovation phasing, the equipment sourcing, the financing structure for the build-out, the timeline for first operational capacity. He'd been running these plans in parallel for months, but plans on paper and execution on the ground were different countries. He had a meeting next week with a regional equipment supplier about the first phase machinery. He had a call scheduled with a structural engineering firm for the foundation assessment he wanted to do in-house before any contractors came in. He had a long list of things he needed and a precise, carefully sequenced plan for getting them. What he didn't have was time that moved slowly. Lily's after-school pickup was at 3:15. It was currently 11:43. He got back to the hydraulic line. The Blackstone job had been finished and filed and moved on from, as far as his active thinking went. He'd sent the complete repair documentation to Marcus as promised. He'd received payment, which had gone directly into the LLC account he'd opened for the Harland project. He'd moved on. What he hadn't anticipated was that he hadn't entirely been moved on from. The call came on a Monday, 3 weeks after the closing, from a number he didn't recognize. He let it go to voicemail, listened to it while eating breakfast. A man named Richard Sloan, identifying himself as Director of Operations at Blackstone Manufacturing, asking if Ethan Carter was available to quote on a quarterly maintenance contract for the primary production systems. He called back. Sloan was pleasant, professional, made the offer sound straightforward. Blackstone had reviewed their maintenance strategy following the recent production line incident and had decided to diversify their service provider relationships. They were interested in adding a specialist contractor with particular expertise in their relay and control systems. "We were impressed with how the situation was handled," Sloan said. "Marcus Webb handled it," Ethan said. "He knew what the problem was likely to be and made the right call." A small pause. "Well, we're interested in having your company on retainer regardless. I'd like to set up a formal meeting to discuss terms." Ethan agreed to a meeting date, then spent 10 minutes of his drive into work doing math in his head about whether he currently had the capacity to take on a Blackstone retainer given everything else in motion. He did not, but the terms would tell him whether it was worth adjusting the timeline. The meeting was scheduled for the following Wednesday at Blackstone's main facility. He showed up in what passed for his professional wardrobe: clean dark pants, a better jacket, boots that had been relatively recently resoled, and was met at reception by Sloan, who was exactly what his phone voice had suggested: competent, organized, slightly formal in the way of someone who'd spent a long time inside corporate hierarchy. They were in the middle of discussing contract parameters when the meeting room door opened and Victoria Langford walked in. Ethan hadn't known she would be there. He suspected, from the way Sloan's posture shifted slightly, that Sloan hadn't known either. "Don't stop on my account," she said, sitting down at the far end of the table. She had a tablet with her and the specific quality of attention of someone who was going to listen to everything without appearing to listen to everything. They continued. The terms were fair. Not generous, but fair, which was what Ethan had said to himself he would accept. He asked 3 questions about system access and documentation standards, which Sloan answered thoroughly, and at the end said he'd have a formal proposal back to them by Friday. Victoria had said nothing during the entire meeting. As Ethan was gathering his materials to leave, she said, "The secondary fault you flagged, in the relay panel." He looked at her. "Yes." "Our maintenance team says if it had progressed another 6 to 8 weeks, we'd have had a repeat failure. Potentially worse because it would have cascaded into the backup relay." "That's consistent with my estimate." She was watching him in a way that was different from the parking lot weeks ago, less dismissive, more precise, like she was recalibrating something. "You could have billed us for that assessment," she said. "I could have," he agreed. "Why didn't you?" He thought about how to answer this in a way that was honest without being tedious. "Because I was already in there," he said. It would have been stranger not to flag it. She looked at him for a moment, then nodded once, the precise nod of someone filing information away. He sent the proposal on Friday. They signed it the following Tuesday. The first scheduled maintenance visit under the new contract was 5 weeks out. Ethan put it in the calendar app that Lily had helped design, in the color she designated for Daddy's work that's not the shop, which was orange. He went back to the Harland mill numbers. The renovation phasing had been revised twice since the closing. The first revision happened because the core sampling revealed that the west foundation section was slightly stronger than his conservative estimate, which opened a more aggressive equipment installation timeline on that side. The second revision happened because the equipment supplier he'd been negotiating with came back with a better lease structure than he'd projected, which affected cash flow modeling for the first 18 months of operation. Both revisions were positive. He was aware this was unusual and tried not to let it make him complacent. He was at the Harland mill on a Saturday morning, walking the first floor with a measuring tape and a notebook, old-fashioned because he thought better on paper than on a tablet when he was doing spatial work, when his phone rang, a number he recognized, Linda Cho. "You have a problem," she said, which was her standard greeting when calling with actual information rather than to check in. "Okay." The environmental assessment came back. He stopped walking. "And? You know the section I flagged as potentially concerning? The northeast corner near the old loading dock. Previous occupant used it for chemical storage in the 80s. Right. The assessment found elevated solvent residue in the soil beneath the concrete slab. Not severe, we're not talking Superfund territory, but it requires remediation before you can get an occupancy modification for manufacturing use." She paused. "I want you to look at the full report before we discuss what this does to the timeline and budget. But I'm calling now because the remediation estimate that's attached it's not small." "How not small?" She told him. He stood in the first floor of the Harland mill with the measuring tape in his hand and did the math in his head. The number Linda had just given him was real, not catastrophic, but it moved several things on the timeline and required him to renegotiate the phasing of the first equipment deployment. "Okay," he said. "That's it? Okay. I need to see the full report. Can you send it now?" "Already sent." A pause. "Ethan, this is a significant—" "I know what it is," he said. "Not sharp, just clear. I need to read the report and run the revised numbers before I know if it changes the core plan or just the sequence. I'll call you Sunday." He put the phone in his pocket and looked at the northeast corner of the building. From where he stood, it looked exactly the same as the rest of the floor. Stained concrete, old racking bolt patterns in the ground, light coming through the high windows at an angle that made the dust visible. Underneath it, apparently, was a complication he was now responsible for. He wrote something in the notebook. Then he kept walking. The thing about owning a building is that it owned you back, in small ways and large ones, in ways that the paperwork didn't fully communicate. Ethan had understood this abstractly and was now understanding it concretely, which was a different experience. The Harland Mill was not just a project on a spreadsheet anymore. It was a place with specific problems in its northeast corner and a rail siding that needed new ballast and a second-floor east wing where 3 of the original heating pipes had been removed by a previous contractor and never replaced. It was, in other words, a real thing, with all the complications that implied. He called Roberto on the drive home, not because Roberto was an investor or a stakeholder or needed to know. He wasn't, and he didn't, but because Roberto was the person Ethan had come to use as a sounding board when his thinking needed to be said out loud before he could hear it properly. "Environmental remediation in the northeast section," he said. "Soil contamination from historical use. I need to resequence the first phase build-out." "How bad?" "Manageable, but it delays operational capacity in that section by about 3 months. Roberto was quiet for a moment. "Does it break the model?" "No, it complicates it. But the model still holds." Ethan thought about the numbers he'd run and rerun for 18 months. The specific and defensible engineering analysis of what the Harland Mill could become if restored with the right approach. The projections he'd stress-tested against supply chain disruptions, against equipment cost overruns, against markets performing below current trends. "The model holds," he said. "Then you already know what you're doing." He picked up Lily at Sandra's, and she demanded to hear about his day the way she always did, with the particular intensity of a 6-year-old who'd decided this was important. He told her he'd been at the building again. She asked if there was a pool yet. He said not yet. She accepted this with the patience of someone who had long-term plans. They made dinner together. He made dinner while she narrated what he should be doing differently. And afterward, she wanted to draw, so she sat at the kitchen table with her markers while he opened his laptop and read the environmental assessment report line by line. It was, as Linda had said, manageable. The remediation approach was well established, the timeline was specific, and 2 of the 3 contractors he found in an initial search had done this exact type of work before. He started a comparison sheet. "Daddy," Lily said, without looking up from her drawing. "Yeah. Is your building going to be a real factory?" "That's the plan." "Will it make stuff?" "Precision machine components, parts that go into other machines." She considered this with the seriousness she brought to questions about how things worked. "So your factory makes the stuff that makes the other stuff work?" He looked at her over the laptop screen. 6 years old, markers on her hands, the dolphin water bottle at her elbow. "Yeah," he said. "Exactly that." She nodded like this made sense to her and went back to drawing. He went back to the environmental assessment. The second Blackstone maintenance visit happened 6 weeks after the first. Ethan handled it with one of Roberto's recommendations, a younger technician named Paul, who Ethan had been cross-training on industrial control systems. And the visit was routine in the best sense of the word. Documented, thorough, no surprises. He billed the visit, filed the report, moved on. What he didn't know, and wouldn't know until considerably later, was that the Blackstone contract had been the subject of a brief conversation between Victoria Langford and Kevin Marsh, in which Kevin had said something about that Carter repair shop, and Victoria had said something about specialist contractor, and Kevin had said, right, the small operation Marcus pulled in for the emergency, and the conversation had moved on. Ethan was not a person who occupied mental space in the Blackstone executive suite. He was a vendor, a functional, reliable, fairly priced vendor who had done good work in an emergency. That was the whole of it, as far as the executive suite was concerned. He would have found this entirely unsurprising. He had bigger things to think about. The Harland mill remediation began in the second week of April. He'd selected a contractor named Torres Environmental Services. Family-owned, 18 years in operation, the estimator who came out to the site had been doing this work for 12 years and answered his technical questions directly rather than redirecting to a brochure. The price was not the lowest of the 3 quotes, and not the highest. The timeline was the most realistic. The remediation process required him to be on site more than he'd initially planned, partly because he was the project owner and the decisions were his, and partly because he didn't have the kind of organizational infrastructure that would allow him to delegate this level of critical path work yet. He was at the mill 3 mornings a week during the first month, notebooks and coffee, walking the remediation area and talking to the Torres crew and checking progress against the plan. The Torres foreman was a man named Eddie, who wore the same Mets cap every day regardless of weather, and who had, over the first 2 weeks, developed a healthy respect for Ethan's capacity to understand what was happening in the ground beneath the concrete. "Most owners just want to know when it's done and how much," Eddie said one morning, watching his crew work. "I want to know both of those things," Ethan said, "but understanding the process tells me if the timeline is real." Eddie nodded at this like it was reasonable, which it was. "What do you want the building to be?" Ethan had explained the plan. Eddie had listened with the same focused attention that Ethan recognized in people who did skilled work. The kind of attention that was actually evaluating what was being said rather than waiting to respond. "Precision manufacturing," Eddie said. "High tolerance? Sub-millimeter on the primary components. So the floor has to be right." "The floor has to be exactly right." Eddie looked at the remediation area. "We'll get it clean," he said. "The rest is on you." It was. All of it was on him. On a Thursday afternoon in late April, Ethan was at the Harland mill going over the revised structural drawings with the engineering firm he'd retained for the floor reinforcement specifications when his phone buzzed with a message from Marcus Webb. "Heads up. Company did a vendor review this week. Your contract came up, some discussion about scope. Wanted you to hear it from me before official communication." He read this twice. Then he called Marcus. What kind of discussion? He asked. Marcus's voice had the slight, careful quality of someone navigating between two different sets of obligations. The operations review. They looked at all vendor contracts. Somebody, I don't know who specifically, might have been Kevin Marsh, raised the question of whether the scope of your contract was justified given that it originated from an emergency situation rather than a formal procurement process. Ethan was quiet for a moment. They're not terminating it, Marcus said quickly. Nothing's been decided. It was characterized in the review as a small shop emergency contract and whether it aligned with Blackstone's standard for vendor qualification. What's their standard for vendor qualification? Minimum annual revenue threshold, liability insurance coverage, multi-site service capacity. A pause. Most of those are fine. The revenue threshold is for the tier of contract you're on. It's a number that a 3-year-old repair shop might not hit on the last filing. Ethan thought about the Carter Industrial LLC filing, which was separate from the shop. He thought about what his attorney had advised about the corporate structure and how it was documented. Tell them I'll submit the full vendor qualification package by end of week, he said. All documentation. If there are gaps, I'll address them specifically. I'll pass that along. Marcus hesitated. For what it's worth, I told them the work has been excellent. I know you did. Thanks, Marcus. He filed the vendor qualification package on Friday. Complete documentation, insurance certificates, corporate structure, professional credentials, financial statements from the LLC. He also included, on the last page, the engineering certifications he held. Not as a flourish, just as part of the complete record. He didn't hear back the following week, or the week after. He kept working on the Harland mill. The first phase equipment began arriving in May. 3 precision CNC machining centers on lease agreements, sourced through the supplier he'd been negotiating with for 4 months, delivered on a Tuesday morning by a flatbed that had some difficulty with the access road and required some creative maneuvering that Ethan spent 20 minutes helping with before Roberto, who'd come to watch, pointed out that they were paying the driver to deal with exactly this situation. You pay people to do things, Roberto said, and then you do the things yourself. He was doing it wrong. He got it off the truck. Eventually. The machining centers were installed across 3 days. Paul, who Ethan had been training and who had turned out to be genuinely good, better than Ethan had expected when he'd first taken him on, handled the alignment work on the second unit. Ethan watched and corrected once, then let him finish. Good, he said. Paul looked like he'd been told he'd won something. Yeah? The calibration sequence. You ran it in the right order without being told. Paul shrugged in the way of someone trying not to look pleased. You wrote it on the board last week. I did. You remembered. He didn't tell people they'd done well unless they had. Roberto had figured this out early. Paul was figuring it out now. It mattered, he felt, to make the positive feedback mean something. The vendor situation at Blackstone resolved itself, though not in the way he'd expected. The official communication came not from Richard Sloan, but from Devin, Victoria's assistant, in the form of a brief email. Thank you for submitting the vendor qualification documentation. Your contract has been reviewed and approved for continuation under current terms. He filed the email. 2 days later, he got another email from Devin. Miss Langford would like to schedule a brief call at your convenience to discuss the Blackstone vendor relationship going forward. Please indicate your availability. He looked at this for a moment. Then he replied with 3 available times. The call happened on a Wednesday morning when he was in the shop office and Roberto was handling a routine service job in the Bay. Victoria Langford's voice was the same on the phone as it was in person, precise and slightly faster than the average person's speech, like she was consistently editing for time. The vendor review flagged your contract because it originated outside our standard procurement process, she said. I want to explain that directly. I appreciate it. The documentation you submitted was complete, more complete than some of our Tier 1 vendors, which is apparently a thing I need to address separately. A pause. I also saw that you hold 4 active engineering patents. He hadn't thought of that as notable. Yes? In control systems and precision machining. 3 in control systems, one in machining process efficiency. Why is that not on your website? He thought about Carter's Mechanicals website, which Roberto's cousin had built for them 2 years ago, and which primarily featured a photo of the shop exterior that was slightly out of focus and a list of services in a font that was too small. It didn't come up, he said. A pause with a texture he couldn't quite read. The secondary fault you flagged after the emergency repair, she said. The documentation you submitted. That was original analysis, wasn't it? Not boilerplate. You'd done original diagnostic reasoning on a fault mode that our system's standard protocols wouldn't detect. Yes. Where did that analysis come from? Experience with similar systems, and some published research on thermal expansion failure modes in the J-series relay design that didn't circulate widely because it came out of a small European industrial journal 3 years ago. Another pause. You read European industrial journals? When they're relevant, he could hear on the other end of the line something happening that he couldn't identify precisely. She was recalibrating again, the way she had in the meeting room, some internal adjustment of a model that had previously contained him as a simple data point. The contract will continue, she said. I wanted to make that clear directly. Thank you. And if in the future you want to flag anything else you observe during maintenance visits, anything you think we should know, you can send it through Devin's email. I've been sending those notes to Marcus. I know. I've been reading them. A pause. I wanted you to know that. He thought about the 3 maintenance visit reports he'd submitted, each of which had included a 1-paragraph observation section with anything he'd noticed beyond the scope of the contracted work. He'd written them the same way he wrote everything, directly, without editorializing. Okay, he said. Good. The tone shifted slightly, the small gear change of someone wrapping up. How is the work going? Generally. The question was unexpected in its generality. He wasn't sure if she meant the Blackstone contract or something else, or if it was just a conversational close. Well, he said. Generally, well. She said goodbye and the call ended, and he sat in the shop office for a moment with the phone in his hand, thinking about the particular quality of that last exchange. Something had shifted in the nature of it, not dramatically, not in a way that was visible or definitive, but shifted nonetheless. Like a piece of machinery that had been slightly misaligned and had, without anyone making a specific adjustment, settled into better tolerance. He put the phone down and went back to work. The Harland Mill first phase build-out was 41% complete by the end of May. He knew this because he had a tracking sheet. The tracking sheet was on a legal pad rather than a project management software because he'd tried the software and found he thought better by hand. The first operational test of the machining center installation was scheduled for the first week of June. He had 4 potential clients for initial production capacity, 2 of which had signed letters of intent contingent on the operational qualification tests. The tests would take 3 days. He'd run them himself, with Paul. On a Sunday evening in late May, Ethan sat on the porch of his house with the slightly broken swing, still not fixed, and a cup of coffee, while Lily ran in the backyard catching fireflies in a jar that she was never going to poke holes in, and then expressing surprise when they died. A cycle that had repeated twice now with great emotional investment each time. He'd been meaning to explain to her that the jar needed holes. He kept forgetting, and she kept repeating the experiment, and he was beginning to think this was either a lesson in scientific method or proof that hope was more resilient than evidence. "Daddy, I caught 3, she called across the yard. "Don't forget to poke holes in the jar," he said. She looked at the jar, then at him, with the specific expression of a 6-year-old who had just realized something obvious and was determining whether to acknowledge it. "Oh," she said, "there's a nail in the toolbox on the porch." She got the nail. She poked holes with the focused effort of someone solving a problem. Then she went back to the fireflies. He drank his coffee and thought about the June testing timeline and the Torres environmental final inspection and the second equipment delivery scheduled for mid-July and the 4 potential clients and the things that could still go wrong. They were real and various. The things that could go wrong. He'd cataloged them with the same precision he cataloged everything, and he knew which ones were manageable and which ones would be serious, and what the range of likely outcomes actually was if he stayed honest with himself. He'd stayed honest with himself for 32 years. It had not always been comfortable. It had, on balance, served him reasonably well. From the backyard, Lily called out, "Daddy, they're glowing! I see them!" "It's because they want to talk to each other," she explained, with the authority of someone who had formed a definitive theory. "The light is how they say things." He looked at the firefly jar visible from the porch in the evening light. "Is that right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I read it." He was almost certain she had not, in fact, read it, but the principle she'd identified was accurate, so he let it stand. The coffee had gone slightly cold. He drank it anyway. Tomorrow was Monday. There was a Harland Mill structural inspection at 7 a.m., a Blackstone quarterly documentation review at 2 p.m., a parts order to finalize for a client's custom fabrication job at the shop, and Lily's Wednesday parent event that he'd shifted to the top of the calendar because it was non-negotiable in a way that the other things, ultimately, were not. He finished the coffee and went in. On the kitchen counter, next to the dolphin water bottle, was Lily's drawing from last week, the one she'd made at the table while he'd read the environmental assessment. It was a building, large and square, with windows drawn in the slightly irregular way of a child who's decided that precision matters but hasn't quite achieved it. Smoke coming from the roof in a friendly way. A flag on top that he couldn't identify. He'd asked her what the building was, and she'd said, matter-of-factly, "Your factory." He'd asked her what the flag was. She'd said, "That's so people can find it." He left the drawing where it was. He'd moved it twice and it kept ending up back on the counter, which suggested she wanted it there. He went to bed. The machining centers were operational. The remediation was clean. The model held. He'd deal with what came next when it came. The operational qualification tests ran for 4 days instead of 3. Not because anything went wrong, though Ethan had prepared extensively for things going wrong, but because on the 3rd day, during the final calibration sequence on the second machining center, Paul caught a tolerance variance of 0.003 millimeters that was within acceptable range for most applications and outside acceptable range for what Ethan intended to produce. They stopped. They ran the calibration again from the beginning. They found a thermal compensation setting in the machine's control firmware that had been configured for the previous owner's production environment rather than the Harland Mill's floor temperature profile. It took 6 hours to identify and correct. Paul found it, actually. Ethan had been working from the control panel on the 3rd unit when Paul said, from across the floor, "Hey, can you look at this?" in the tone of voice that meant he'd found something real. Ethan looked at it. Then he looked at it again. Then he said, "Good catch," which was not a phrase he used as a placeholder. Paul wrote it into the qualification report with more detail than was strictly required. Ethan let him. Detail in documentation was not a quality he was going to discourage. The 2 letters of intent converted to signed contracts in the 2nd week of June. The first was a mid-sized aerospace components supplier named Vantech Systems that had been sourcing a specific class of hydraulic fitting from an overseas manufacturer and wanted a domestic option that could meet their dimensional tolerances. The second was a medical device manufacturer, smaller company, more demanding specifications, the kind of client that would require 6 months of consistent performance data before they'd expand the relationship, but the kind of client that, once committed, stayed committed. Ethan spent 3 evenings reviewing both contracts with Linda Cho, who had long since stopped questioning the fundamental decision to buy the mill and had shifted into the mode of someone trying to make sure the operational pieces held together legally. "The Vantech tolerances," she said during the 2nd evening call. "You're sure these are achievable consistently, not just on the qualification run?" "The machines are capable of it. Whether we achieve it consistently depends on process control and operator training." "And you have both?" "I have the process control documented. The operator training is ongoing. Paul is good. I need 2 more people at his level within the next 4 months." "Where are you going to find them?" He'd been thinking about this. "There's a machining program at Riverside Community College. I've been in contact with the department. They have graduates who can't find positions because most manufacturers want experience, not new certificates." "You're going to hire people without experience." I'm going to hire people without industry experience who have the technical foundation and train them on our specific processes. That's different from hiring people without the ability to learn. A pause. It's also cheaper in the short term and better in the medium term because they don't have bad habits from somewhere else. Linda was quiet for a moment. You've thought about this. I've thought about all of it, he said. Not impatiently, just as a statement of fact. He had. For 18 months before the purchase and every day since. The thinking was not over. It would not be over, probably, for as long as the business existed. But it was thorough in a way that gave him something to stand on when things got complicated, which they did, regularly, because that was what running something meant. The summer moved at the pace of operational reality, which is to say it moved faster than he'd wanted and slower than he'd planned in approximately equal measure. The Vantech production run started in July. A modest initial order, clearly structured as a trial, the kind of thing where the buyer was watching not just the parts, but the producer. Ethan ran quality checks at 3 points in every production sequence rather than the 2 that were standard. He built the third check into the documented process, so it wasn't extra work for anyone. It was just the work. The first delivery went out on a Tuesday. Vantech's quality team came back with a report in 9 days, within specification on all dimensions. 2 parts flagged for surface finish review, both ultimately accepted. A note at the bottom of the report, brief and professional, consistent with stated capabilities. Next order to follow. He showed this to Roberto, who read it and said, "That's it? That's the whole thing?" "That's how it starts," Ethan said. Roberto handed it back. "My brother-in-law thought you were insane." "You mentioned." "He wants to know if you're hiring." Ethan thought about the 2 additional operators he needed. "What's his background?" 7 years at a stamping plant. Before that, some machining work. "Tell him to come by Friday." Roberto's brother-in-law, whose name was Dario, which Ethan learned on Friday, had 7 years at a stamping plant, a slight wariness about whether this was a real offer or a courtesy interview that he was working to conceal with moderate success, and hands that showed actual manufacturing work rather than supervisory distance from it. He answered Ethan's technical questions directly and said, "I don't know," twice when he didn't know, rather than guessing. Ethan liked that. He offered him a position starting the following Monday. Dario said he needed to give 2 weeks' notice at his current job. Ethan said that was fine. They shook hands. Walking back to his truck afterward, Ethan pulled out his notebook and crossed one item off a list that had 17 items on it. He looked at the remaining 16 and thought about sequencing. The Blackstone maintenance contract was running smoothly in the background. 2 visits, both routine, both documented, the kind of working relationship that operated on competence and didn't require much relationship maintenance. Marcus Webb had sent him a note after the second visit saying that a new executive had reviewed the maintenance reports and wanted to know who'd written the observation sections because they were unusually specific. Ethan had told Marcus to tell them it was the technician of record, and the observations were part of standard service documentation. Marcus had sent back a single reply. I passed that along. The follow-up question was, "Is this Carter himself?" And I said yes. Thought you should know. He hadn't followed up on that. There were too many other things. In September, the medical device client placed a second order, larger than the first, with a note from their procurement manager that said they were considering expanding the component classification they sourced domestically and would be in contact about specifications. Ethan read this note 3 times, then filed it, and went back to the floor where Paul and Dario were running the afternoon production sequence. He watched for a few minutes without saying anything. They were working well together. Dario's manufacturing experience and Paul's control systems knowledge had created a natural division of labor that was more efficient than either of them alone. He hadn't engineered this. It had happened because he'd put 2 capable people in the same space and let them figure it out. He went back to his office, a repurposed manager's room on the north end of the first floor with a window that looked onto the production floor, and started working on the specifications for the 3rd equipment unit he was planning to bring in for the 2nd phase expansion. The expansion was ahead of the original timeline by about 6 weeks. He'd revised the timeline projection 3 times since the acquisition closed, always based on actual data rather than optimism. The data was, so far, consistently better than his conservative projections and slightly below his optimistic ones. This seemed like the appropriate place to be. He was deep in the equipment specifications when his phone buzzed. Linda. The Vantech account manager called me, she said. He looked up from the drawings. Why did they call you? Because they're interested in a longer-term supply agreement, and they want to know if Carter Industrial has the capacity to support a volume that's approximately 3 times your current output. A pause. I told them I'd need to discuss it with you. What's the timeline they're thinking? 12 months to ramp. They're shifting supply chain strategy, moving away from the overseas supplier across the board, not just on your component class. They're looking for a domestic partner who can grow with them. He set down his pen. Send me the preliminary terms when they have them. They want a meeting first with you, not just me. I know. Tell them I'm available next Thursday after 2. He put the phone down and sat for a moment. 3 times current output in 12 months. That was a different kind of scaling than the organic growth he'd been managing. That was a structural change that would require equipment, people, process documentation at a different level. Probably a dedicated quality manager rather than integrating quality into the production roles. He got up, went to the production floor window, and looked at Paul and Dario running the afternoon sequence with focused, quiet efficiency. Everything that was true about the model was still true. The question was how fast he was willing to push it. He went back to the equipment specifications. It was around this time, late September, early October, that things at Blackstone Manufacturing began to go quietly wrong in a way that nobody on the inside fully understood yet. It started with the secondary cooling system on line 3, which had been showing intermittent pressure fluctuations for several weeks. The Blackstone maintenance team had looked at it twice and both times concluded the readings were within acceptable variance. The third time, a production run on a high-priority order was interrupted when the pressure fluctuation became a pressure failure and line 3 went down for 11 hours. 11 hours was not catastrophic the way the primary line failure in January had been catastrophic. It was, however, expensive, and more importantly, it was a symptom. Marcus Webb, filling out the incident report, wrote in the cause field, deferred maintenance on secondary cooling circuit, probable root cause failure in expansion joint sealing. See maintenance log notes from August 14th and September 3rd. The August 14th and September 3rd notes in the maintenance log had both been written by Ethan Carter during his scheduled visits, flagging the cooling circuit as something to monitor. He'd described the pressure readings he'd observed and recommended a full inspection of the expansion joint assembly within 30 days. The recommended inspection had not been scheduled. Marcus sent Ethan a message that said, Line 3 incident, the cooling circuit, the notes you flagged in August and September. Just wanted you to know they came up in the incident report. Ethan read this and felt the particular frustration of someone whose recommendation had been accurate and unused. He didn't respond immediately. He thought about what the right thing to say was. He called Marcus. Is the line back up? He asked, as of an hour ago. What was the repair? Emergency contractor, expansion joint replacement, full circuit flush. 4-hour job. Marcus's voice had a tired quality. The contractor said the joint had been deteriorating for at least 6 months. Ethan thought about August, when he'd written the flag in the maintenance note. It was about 6 months, he said. I know. Marcus sighed. There's a review process question. Who receives the maintenance observation notes and what they do with them? There was apparently a gap in how those notes were being routed internally. Okay. I wanted you to know I raised it. I know you did, Marcus. He filed it. He sent a revised maintenance note format to Devin's email, as Victoria had asked him to, with a clearer priority classification system. Routine observation, recommend action within 30 days, recommend action within 60 days. He made the format simple and direct because the problem wasn't that the information didn't exist. It was that the information wasn't moving through the right channels fast enough. Devin replied within 2 hours. Received. I'll make sure this format goes into the vendor communication protocol going forward. He thought about that for a moment, then moved on. The Vantech meeting happened on Thursday as scheduled, in a conference room at Vantech's regional office, with their procurement director and supply chain manager across the table from Ethan and Linda. The preliminary terms were aggressive: volume commitments, delivery timelines, quality thresholds. But the numbers worked if the expansion went as projected. He asked 4 specific questions about the tolerance specifications for the expanded component classes, which the supply chain manager answered from memory, which told him something useful about how seriously they'd already thought this through. He said he'd have a formal response within 2 weeks. In the car afterward, Linda said, "You're going to say yes." "I'm going to say yes to a modified version of the terms," he said. "The ramp timeline needs 6 additional weeks, and the initial volume commitment needs to be staged rather than fixed. They'll push back on the timeline. They'll push back and then they'll accept it because the alternative is continuing with the overseas supplier at a cost structure they've already decided they want to move away from." Linda looked at him from the passenger seat. "When did you get confident?" He thought about this. "I was always confident about the engineering," he said. "The business part took longer." "It's showing." He wasn't entirely sure if this was a compliment or an observation. With Linda, the line between those two things was sometimes difficult to locate. The formal response went out on a Tuesday, with the modified timeline and staged commitment structure he'd described. Vantech came back in 3 days, not 2 weeks, 3 days, with a counter that split the difference on the timeline and accepted the staged commitment. He reviewed it with Linda, made 1 additional adjustment on the liability terms, and they had an agreement by the end of the week. He told Paul and Dario on Friday afternoon, in the kind of brief, direct way that he felt news like this deserved. Not a big production, not a speech, just the facts and what they meant. "We're expanding," he said, 12 months, approximately 3 times current output. "We'll bring in 2 more units by February, and I need to start interviewing for a 3rd operator and a quality coordinator in the next 30 days. Paul said, "Is Roberto's cousin available? The one who built the website?" "The website cousin is a web designer, not a machinist." "Right. What about the Riverside program?" "Already in contact." Dario said, "My brother-in-law does quality work, different industry, but tell him to come by." Paul looked at Dario. "He hired you based on your brother-in-law's recommendation." "I came in and interviewed," Dario said, "and he hired you. That's how hiring works." Ethan left them to this discussion and went back to his office. It was October now. The Harland Mill, Carter Industrial, officially, the sign above the main entrance had gone up in August, block letters, nothing elaborate, was 16 months from the day he'd signed the purchase agreement. The building smelled different than it had when he'd first walked it. It smelled like coolant fluid and metal and the industrial soap the Torres crew used on the floors. It smelled operational. He sat at his desk and looked at the production floor through the window. The afternoon light came through the high east windows at an angle that made the machining centers look, briefly, almost cinematic. He looked at this for a moment, then went back to work. The incident that changed everything, not for Ethan, but for Victoria, happened in late October, and it started not with a dramatic failure, but with an internal audit that Blackstone had scheduled as a routine annual exercise. The audit firm was Prescott and Associates, a regional accounting and operations consultancy that Blackstone had used for several years. Their scope this cycle included a vendor relationship review, which was standard. Devon had mentioned this to Ethan in August when she'd sent the updated vendor communication protocol, and he'd filed it without much thought. The lead auditor at Prescott assigned to the Blackstone engagement was a woman named Claire Nguyen, who was thorough in the way of someone who had been burned once by not being thorough enough and had not forgotten it. She pulled every vendor file, every contract, every maintenance log, every incident report. The Line 3 incident report landed in her review on a Tuesday. She read the maintenance observation notes that had preceded it, the August flagging, the September flagging, the fact that neither had been acted on before the failure. She pulled the complete file on the Carter Industrial Maintenance contract. She read the original incident report from January, the one about the primary production line failure, and she read the subsequent vendor qualification documentation. She did what auditors do with things that don't immediately make sense in their expected context. She dug. The Carter Industrial LLC corporate filing was public record. The professional credentials in the vendor qualification package were verifiable. She verified them. The engineering patents, 4 active patents, 2 additional patents pending that hadn't been in the qualification package because they were recent, were in the public database. She read the abstracts. She cross-referenced the names on the patents with a standard industry credential database. Then she did something that wasn't strictly part of the audit scope, but that she later described as professional instinct. She searched the engineering literature. The J7 relay panel bus bar failure mode that Ethan had identified in his repair documentation, the one he described as coming from a small European industrial journal, was, in fact, documented. The article he'd mentioned was real. But there was also, in a major North American engineering journal, a 2020 paper on control system failure analysis that cited that European article and discussed the failure mode in substantially more technical depth. The author of the North American paper was listed as E. Carter, affiliated with what was then the Engineering Research Division at Harland Technologies. Claire Nguyen stared at this for a while. She pulled the Harland Technologies public record, a significant industrial conglomerate with an engineering division that had been closed in a restructuring 4 years ago. She found the press release about the restructuring. She found the list of projects the engineering division had worked on before closing. One of them was a precision manufacturing efficiency study that had resulted in a process patent. The patent was one of the 4 in Ethan Carter's portfolio. She kept pulling. What she found, piece by piece, was a picture of a person that did not fit the category she'd initially placed him in. The repair shop, Carter's Mechanical. That was 3 years old. Before that, a period that was harder to trace directly from public records. But the patents, the published research, the engineering credentials from an institution she recognized as serious, those told a different story than small-town repairman. She wrote a section in her audit report. She labeled it Vendor Profile Review, Carter Industrial LLC, and she wrote it carefully because she was aware that she was putting information in front of people that they were not expecting. The audit report went to Devin first, as the primary administrative contact, on a Wednesday morning in late October. Devin read the vendor section twice. Then she walked down the hall to Victoria Langford's office and stood in the doorway. Victoria was on a call. She looked up, registered Devin's expression, and said into the phone, "I'll call you back." She hung up. "What?" Devin put the audit report on the desk, open to the vendor section. "The Prescott audit. There's something in the Carter Industrial Vendor Review you need to read." Victoria looked at her. Then she looked at the report. Devin stood in the doorway while she read it. She watched Victoria's face do the thing it rarely did, lose the controlled, forward-moving expression that was its default, and replace it with something harder to categorize. Victoria read the section once. Then she went back to the top and read it again. "When did he publish this research?" she asked, about the Engineering Journal article. 2020, 4 years before he opened the repair shop. "And the patents?" "The first 3 were filed while he was at Harland Technologies. The 4th was filed about 18 months ago, under Carter Industrial." "That's during the time he was already running the shop." "Yes." Victoria was quiet for a moment. On her desk, next to the audit report, was a printed copy of the Line 3 incident report. She'd been reviewing it that morning, part of the operational review she did after any significant downtime event. The 2 documents sat next to each other. "He flagged the cooling circuit in August," she said. "The incident happened in October." "Yes." "And the flagging is in the maintenance notes that were supposed to be routed through the operations review process." "The audit found a routing gap. The observation notes weren't reaching the right level for action decisions." Victoria sat back in her chair. "He fixed a problem we'd created, flagged a problem we'd missed, and then submitted a corrected reporting format to help us catch problems ourselves going forward." She looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at Devin. "And we reviewed his contract 6 weeks ago to decide if a company with his revenue threshold was appropriate for our vendor tier." Devin said nothing. She had learned over years of working with Victoria Langford that there were moments where saying nothing was the correct contribution. "What else is in the Prescott report about him?" Victoria asked. "His new facility, the Harland Mill property. They noted it during the financial review because it came up as a vendor location. They pulled the business filing. Carter Industrial has apparently signed a supply agreement with Vantex Systems." Victoria looked at her. Vantech, she said. Yes. Vantech Systems was a name Victoria knew well. They'd been a potential Blackstone partner for a component sourcing conversation 2 years ago that had never progressed. The relationship had stayed at the level of industry acquaintance rather than business partnership. What's the Vantech agreement? She asked. The audit report doesn't have details. Publicly, just the registration of the supply agreement. Victoria looked back at the audit report. She looked at the photo in the vendor file that had been taken during the facility inspection, a standard requirement for operational vendor certification. It was a photo of the exterior of Carter Industrial, the building she recognized as the Harland Mill, which she'd last seen mentioned at the Regional Manufacturing Association dinner in August. Nobody I recognized. One of the county planning people mentioned it. Apparently he's been in the building permit records too, pulling historical specs. She'd asked Devin to look into it. Devin had found 3 weeks later that the survey activity was associated with a purchase that had already closed. She'd noted it as interesting and moved on. There had been other things. She stood up from her desk and went to the window. Her office looked out over the city, which in late October was doing the gray and amber thing that it did this time of year, the light coming at an angle that made the buildings look slightly more significant than they probably were. When is his next scheduled maintenance visit? She asked. Devin checked her tablet. November 14th. Victoria thought for a moment. Can you get me a full profile? Everything publicly available on Carter Industrial and Ethan Carter personally. Engineering publications, the patent filings, the full text if you can get it, the Harland Mill acquisition details, whatever the Vantech agreement is publicly registered as. I'll have it by end of day. Good. She turned back from the window. Also get me everything on the Line 3 cooling circuit. The full history, from the first installation, every maintenance record, every observation note. Devin left. Victoria stood at the window for another moment. She was thinking about a parking lot in January and a man in grease-stained boots climbing out of an old truck, and the way she'd looked at him, or rather, the way she hadn't. Kevin Marsh appeared at her door sometime in the mid-afternoon. He had the expression of someone who'd read the audit report and had arrived to discuss the section about Carter Industrial. I saw the Prescott report, he said. I know. The vendor section, I've read it. The patents alone, those are significant. And the Vantech relationship, if the scale of that agreement is what Kevin. She said his name with the particular tone she used when he was about to state something she'd already incorporated. I know. He stopped. What are you going to do? She thought about the question for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she was being careful about how she expressed it. I'm going to correct a mistake, she said. How I do that is still being decided. He looked at her for another moment, then nodded and left. The full profile Devin assembled was delivered at 5:47 p.m. in a folder that was more substantial than Victoria had expected. She read it that evening at her apartment, which she did not think of as working late because she did not recognize the concept of late in the way most people did. She just recognized work that needed doing and time in which to do it. The engineering publications were 8 in total, spanning 7 years. 3 in the major journals, 2 in specialist publications, 3 in conference proceedings. She was not an engineer and she did not pretend to follow the technical content completely, but she understood enough to recognize the quality of thinking behind the writing, the precision, the specificity, the absence of hedging language. He wrote the same way he talked, direct, not performative. The patent filings were more accessible. She read the abstracts and then the claims sections, which were where the actual intellectual content lived. The third patent, the one for a control system optimization process, described in technical language a methodology that she recognized from the way the maintenance observation notes were structured. The same underlying logic, the same way of sequencing information to identify root causes rather than symptoms. He'd been applying a patented methodology to her maintenance documentation and hadn't mentioned it. She thought about this for a long time. The Harland Mill acquisition details were public record. The purchase price, the environmental remediation filing, the building permits for the renovation work. What wasn't in the public record was the operational model. She could see from the building permits what he was putting in the building, but not what he intended to do with it, the specific client relationships, the production strategy. Vantech Systems, a supply agreement of indeterminate scope with one of the more significant precision components buyers in the region. She realized, been watching a company get built from the inside of her own maintenance reports and hadn't recognized what she was seeing. The Blackstone maintenance notes, the ones she'd told Devon she wanted routed to her directly, the ones she said she'd been reading, she had read them. She'd read them and processed them as maintenance documentation. Competent, thorough, unusually well-structured maintenance documentation from a vendor who was good at his job. She hadn't read them as what they also were, which was the work product of someone whose understanding of industrial control systems was, by any objective measure, more sophisticated than the expertise she was paying her Tier 1 contractors for. She closed the folder at 9:14 p.m. On her desk was a note she'd written herself. November 14th, maintenance visit, Blackstone. She'd planned to be at a board dinner that day. She'd been planning to send Kevin to handle the operational portion of the week. She picked up the note and looked at it for a moment. Then she added a line below the original. Be there. The thing about building something, a company, a reputation, a framework for understanding an industry, was that it required constant updating. Victoria Langford knew this. She'd built her own company on the principle that the people who succeeded were the ones who were willing to look at new information and revise their model, rather than protect the model from the information. She'd been holding an incomplete model for 10 months. She was revising it now. The Line 3 cooling circuit incident, the audit report, the patent filings, the Vantech agreement, all of it was going into the revision. But underneath all of it, if she was honest with herself, was something simpler. A moment in a parking lot in January, a man with a second-hand toolbox, and a judgment she'd made in under 3 seconds that she had not revisited until someone else put the evidence in front of her. That was the part she was less comfortable with. Not because it was unfamiliar. She'd made fast judgments her entire career, and most of them had been correct, and the correct ones had built what she had. But this one hadn't been correct, and the reason it hadn't been correct was not insufficient information. She'd had enough to look. She'd chosen not to. She didn't like that. She was the kind of person who liked what she could fix more than what she couldn't, and this sat in the complicated category, the category of things she could address going forward but couldn't undo. She filed it there and went to bed at 10:30, which was early for her, and lay awake for 20 minutes longer than usual. In a house on the east side of the city, with a slightly broken porch swing and a pair of rain boots by the door, Ethan Carter was at the kitchen table with the Vantech expansion production schedule and a cup of tea that had gone cold, working through the equipment integration timeline for the February installation. The drawing of the factory, Lily's drawing, the one with the flag on top so people could find it, was still on the counter where it had been for months. He got the timeline to a place he was satisfied with, saved it, closed the laptop. He checked the Dolphin water bottle. Full, cold, in the refrigerator. He went to bed. The 14th of November came in cold and gray, the kind of morning that arrived without ceremony and stayed without apology. The sky over the city was the flat white of overcast light that couldn't decide whether to produce rain or simply hold the threat of it indefinitely. Ethan drove to Blackstone's facility in the F-150 with the heater running and a travel mug of coffee in the cup holder and a maintenance checklist on the passenger seat that he'd reviewed the night before and would review again before he started the actual work. He arrived at 7:48. The scheduled visit was 8 o'clock. The parking lot was more populated than usual for this hour. He noticed the black SUV near the main entrance, the same model he'd seen in January, though whether it was the same vehicle he couldn't say. He noticed it and filed it without particular significance and went to sign in at the security desk. Marcus Webb met him in the lobby, which was slightly unusual. Marcus typically met him at the production floor entrance, not reception. "Morning," Marcus said. "Morning. Everything okay?" "Yeah, fine." Marcus had the quality of someone who had information he was navigating carefully. "Ms. Langford is in the building today." Ethan looked at him. "She does that sometimes," Marcus said. "Comes in for operational reviews. It's not—" He paused. "She asked to be updated when you arrived." Ethan thought about this for a moment. He thought about the audit report that he knew, in broad outline, had been submitted. Devon had mentioned the audit timeline when they'd exchanged correspondence about the revised maintenance format. He thought about what an audit of Blackstone's vendor relationships might produce if someone looked carefully. Okay, he said. They went to the production floor. He started the maintenance visit the same way he always did. A full walk of the primary line before touching any equipment, observing the running state of the systems with the kind of attention that didn't announce itself. He checked the junction relay panel first, the one he'd repaired in January, which was performing exactly as it should. He checked the secondary relay systems, the cooling circuit integration that had been updated after the Line 3 incident, the transformer array in the subfloor corridor. He was in the subfloor corridor, crouched next to the transformer array with a diagnostic reader, when he heard footsteps on the metal stairs behind him. He knew before he looked up. Victoria Langford came down the subfloor stairs in a way that suggested she'd been in subfloor access corridors before, which not everyone navigated with that kind of practical assurance. She was wearing the same mode of dress he'd seen every time, controlled, professional, but without the executive team surrounding her, she looked slightly different, less like a position and more like a person. She stopped a few feet away and looked at the transformer array, then at him. "Don't stop on my account," she said. He turned back to the diagnostic reader. "I've got about 8 more minutes on this section." She stood there while he finished. He was aware of her standing there and proceeded with the same pace and sequence he would have used regardless, because rushing the diagnostic read would have been pointless, and the reason for rushing would have been vanity. When he finished, he stood up and made a note on the checklist. "The transformer array is performing within normal parameters," he said. "I'll check the harmonic distortion readings on the secondary outputs before I wrap up down here, but there's nothing flagged." "Good." She paused. "Walk with me for a minute?" He looked at his checklist. He had roughly 2 hours of work left on the scheduled visit. "I can spare a few minutes now. I'll need to get back to the work after." "Understood." They went back up the stairs to the production floor level, where the machines were running their morning sequence, and the noise required a certain volume to speak over without shouting. She led him to the side corridor that ran along the north wall, where it was possible to talk at a normal level. She stopped and turned to face him. There was something in her expression that he hadn't seen before in their limited interactions, a quality of directness that was usually present, but with something underneath it that was different, not comfortable, exactly. More like someone who'd decided to say something difficult and was doing it anyway. "I read the Prescott audit vendor section," she said. "I assumed." "You assumed I'd read it, or you assumed the audit would find what it found?" "Both," he said. "An audit of your vendor relationships was going to produce a complete picture of Carter Industrial. The picture is accurate." She looked at him for a moment. 8 engineering publications, 4 patents, 2 pending. A supply agreement with Vantech Systems that, from what I can determine, represents a production commitment 3 times the current output of the facility you've built in the last 14 months on a property that every major manufacturer in this region had written off. She said this evenly, not with the tone of someone listing accusations, but with the tone of someone reading out facts they'd verified and needed to say aloud. "Is that complete?" "Mostly. The pending patents may not go through, and the Vantech ramp timeline is still dependent on the February equipment installation running on schedule, which I believe it will but haven't confirmed yet." "Why are you hedging on those specific points and not the others?" "Because those are the ones where the outcome isn't fully determined yet. The published research is done. The approved patents are filed. The current production performance is documented." He held her gaze. "I try not to state things with more certainty than I actually have." She was quiet for a moment. On the production floor behind them, a forklift moved between stations with the steady mechanical purpose of a facility running well. "I'd like to ask you something," she said, "and I'd like you to answer it directly." "Go ahead." "When you came here in January, did you know who I was?" He thought about how to answer this accurately. "I knew you were the CEO. I knew the company. I didn't know you personally. But you knew enough to know that I was..." She paused, choosing the word, "significant in the regional industry context." "Yes." "And you came anyway, in that truck, with that toolbox." "The truck runs fine," he said. "The toolbox has what I need in it." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile. Something more internal than that. I looked at you in the parking lot, she said, and I made a decision about what I was looking at. I know. You knew at the time? He thought about the parking lot in January. The cold air, the overhead lights, the way her eyes had moved from his truck to him and then moved away again. I recognized the look, he said. I've been getting it for a while. And you didn't say anything. What would I have said? She didn't answer that immediately because there wasn't a good answer to it, and she was honest enough not to invent one. The secondary fault flag, she said. In the original repair, you could have billed us for that. We've had this conversation. I know. I'm having it again. She crossed her arms, not defensively, but in the way of someone organizing their thinking physically. Every time I pull one of your maintenance observation notes, there's something in it that's past what the contract requires. The format you revised and sent Devin. The line 3 cooling circuit. The harmonic distortion readings you flag even though they're within normal parameters because you're tracking the trend rather than just the point-in-time value. She paused. You're doing about 40% more work than we're paying you for. I'm doing the work that seems necessary, he said. The contract defines the minimum. It doesn't define the ceiling. Why? He looked at her steadily. Because the job is the job. It's not a performance for the contract terms. She was quiet for long enough that the forklift on the production floor completed another full circuit before she spoke again. I came in today because I wanted to have this conversation in person, she said. Not on a phone call, not through Devin, not in a formal meeting with legal on both sides. She uncrossed her arms. I made a judgment about you in January that was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of having insufficient information. Wrong in the sense that I looked at what you were carrying and didn't look at you. He didn't say anything. I'm not explaining this to get absolution, she said. I'm explaining it because it's true and you're entitled to hear it directly. The bluntness of this was, he thought, the most human thing she'd said to him across their entire history of interaction. Not polished, not positioned, just the thing itself, stated plainly. I appreciate it, he said. It was not a dismissal. He meant it. The vendor contract, she said. I want to expand the scope, not just maintenance visits. I want to bring you in on the operational assessment we're doing for the Line 4 upgrade project. The engineering specifications, the control system integration, the failure mode analysis before installation rather than after. She paused. The work you've been doing in the observation notes, I want to formalize that. Pay for it properly. He considered this. Send me the project scope and I'll tell you if our capacity supports it. Your capacity. She said it with a slight emphasis that wasn't mocking but was noting something. Carter Industrial's capacity. Yes. You're expanding. February installation, 2 additional units, then a Q2 hiring phase if the Vantech ramp performs as projected. She looked at him for a moment. You built a manufacturing company in 14 months on a property nobody else wanted. I'm building it, he said. It's not built yet. What's the distinction? The distinction is that I still have about 140 items on the project list that aren't complete. The model is working. The model working is not the same as the model being finished. She made a small sound that was somewhere between acknowledgement and something harder to name. You're not easy to compliment. I'm not uncomfortable with compliments, he said. I just prefer accuracy. That's the same thing in practice. He thought about this briefly. Maybe. From the production floor, Marcus Webb appeared at the corridor entrance, caught Ethan's eye, and held up 5 fingers in the way that meant the secondary cooling system check was ready whenever he was. Ethan acknowledged this with a nod. I need to get back to the maintenance visit, he said. Victoria nodded. Send the scope feedback to Devin when you've looked at it. I will. He went back to the floor. She stood in the corridor for a moment before going back toward the operations center, and Marcus, who had watched this entire exchange from a careful distance, came over to Ethan and said very quietly, Is everything okay? Fine, Ethan said. She came in specifically today. She never comes in on maintenance days. I know. Did she? Marcus. He picked up the diagnostic reader. Everything is fine. Let's do the cooling system check. Marcus let it go, which was one of his most professionally valuable qualities. The rest of the maintenance visit ran 2 hours and 12 minutes. Ethan documented everything, flagged 1 item for monitoring on the next visit, a minor bearing noise on a conveyor drive motor that was not yet at action threshold but was trending in a direction that bore watching, and sent the complete report to Devin's email before he'd left the parking lot. He sat in the F-150 for a moment before starting the engine. The conversation with Victoria had been, he thought about the right word for it, not uncomfortable. He'd been in genuinely uncomfortable conversations, and this hadn't been that. It had been the conversation of two people who were working out an honest accounting of something, and honest accounting, even when the numbers were unflattering, was the kind of thing he respected. She'd said something true and difficult directly to his face and hadn't softened it into vagueness. He understood that had cost her something. It didn't require a reciprocal performance from him, but it deserved to be recognized for what it was. He started the truck and drove back to Carter Industrial. The expanded scope proposal arrived from Devin 4 days later. It was detailed, 23 pages, including technical specifications for the Line 4 upgrade project, the control system integration requirements, the timeline for the engineering assessment phase. Someone had put real work into it. He read it that evening after Lily was in bed, at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, making notes in the margins of the printed copy. He called Linda the next morning. Blackstone wants a formal engineering assessment contract, he said. Not just maintenance. Assessment, specification review, failure mode analysis on the Line 4 upgrade. Scope? 23 pages. I'm going to want to talk through the liability terms on the assessment work specifically. What's the compensation structure? He told her. A pause. That's a significant step up from the maintenance retainer. Yes. Are you prepared to take that on given the Vantech ramp timeline? The Vantech work is production. This is engineering assessment. They don't compete for the same resources. He paused. They do compete for my time, which is the actual constraint. So the question is whether you have the bandwidth. The question is whether I can structure the Blackstone engagement so that the assessment work is scheduled around the Vantech ramp milestones. He'd already thought through the sequencing. The answer is yes if the Blackstone timeline has flexibility in the first quarter. I'll need to ask Devin about that. And if it doesn't, then I'll tell them the timeline needs to shift and give them an honest explanation of why. Linda was quiet for a moment. You know, most people, when they get an offer like this, don't lead with the constraints. Most people don't want to take on work they can't deliver on, he said. Most people also don't say that out loud to the client. It's not radical transparency, he said. It's just accurate communication. He could hear her exhale in the slight way she had when she was deciding not to argue a point. Send me the contract when you want to start the markup. He sent it that afternoon. They went back and forth on 3 specific clauses over the next week. 2 about liability scope, 1 about intellectual property on any analytical methodologies he used in the assessment work, which was the one he felt most strongly about and which took the longest to resolve. The final language acknowledged that he brought proprietary analytical frameworks to the engagement, and that Blackstone was licensing the output of those frameworks for the specific project, not the frameworks themselves. It was the right language. It had taken a paragraph of explanation to Linda and 2 rounds of back and forth with Blackstone's legal team to get there, but it was right. The signed contract came back on a Tuesday. He filed it, opened a new project folder, and started building the Line 4 assessment timeline. December moved at its own pace, which was faster than any other month in the year for reasons that had nothing to do with work and everything to do with a 7-year-old who had recently become extremely specific about the nature and timing of holiday preparations. Lily had opinions about the tree. She had opinions about the lights. She had a detailed theory about the optimal placement of the star on top that she was willing to defend at length. It has to be straight, she said, from her position on the couch where she was supervising. Ethan, on a step stool with the star in his hand, said, "It is straight." "It's tilted." He looked at it. It was possibly very slightly tilted. "Better?" "A little more." "No, that's too much." "Lily?" "A little less." He adjusted it by what he estimated was 1/8 of an inch. "How's that?" She considered with the seriousness of someone doing quality control. "Okay," she said. "That's good." He got down from the step stool. The tree was, objectively, not perfectly straight in any of its components. The trunk was slightly off-center in the stand, the lights were distributed with the enthusiastic randomness of a 7-year-old who believed quantity was as important as placement, And there was a cluster of ornaments on the left center section that was denser than anywhere else, because that was the section Lily could reach without assistance. He looked at it. "It looks good," he said, and meant it. She leaned against him from beside the couch, the way she did sometimes, without announcement. He put his arm around her. "Daddy," she said. "Yeah. Is the factory going to be busy at Christmas?" "It keeps running," he said. "Paul and Dario are managing the December schedule. I'll check in, but I'm not going to be there every day." "So you'll be home more?" "Some days. Yeah." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the tree. "Sandra says you work a lot." "Sandra's not wrong." "Do you like it? Working a lot?" He thought about how to answer this in a way that was true for a 7-year-old and also true for him. "I like the work," he said. "Sometimes I work more than I should. That part I'm still figuring out." She seemed to accept this. "Okay. Why?" "I just wanted to know." She pushed off from the couch and went to rearrange 3 ornaments that she'd apparently decided were in the wrong position, and the conversation moved on the way conversations with 7-year-olds moved on. Suddenly, without ceremony, because the next thing was already more interesting than the last. He stood by the couch and watched her work and thought about what she'd asked. "Do you like it?" The honest answer was complicated in a way that didn't simplify well for either of them. He liked the work itself, the problem-solving, the engineering precision, the specific satisfaction of a well-run system. He was less certain he'd fully resolved the question of what proportion of his waking hours it deserved. He'd think about that in January. December was Lily's month. The first week of January brought the second Vantech delivery. A larger run than the first, the expansion of the relationship that the procurement manager had hinted at in October. The quality report came back in 7 days, within specification on all dimensions, no flags on surface finish, a note from the quality team that said consistent performance, adding to approved supplier list. That last phrase meant something specific in Vantech's procurement system. It meant they were no longer treating Carter Industrial as a trial supplier, but as a confirmed partner. He showed Paul and Dario the report. Paul said, "Approved supplier list, it's good," Ethan said. "It means the relationship is stable. Don't celebrate yet. Stable means we have to keep performing at this level consistently, which is harder than the qualification run." Dario said, "He's not going to let us be happy about this, is he?" Paul said, "He said it's good." He said good and then immediately listed the challenges. "That's his version of a speech," Paul said. Ethan was already walking back to his office. He was not unaware that this was a pattern. He'd thought about it occasionally. The way he delivered positive information in the same tone as neutral information, followed immediately by the next thing that needed attention. It wasn't performative restraint. It was that the next thing genuinely was the thing that needed attention, and resting on the current thing felt like a way of being surprised by the next thing. His father had been the opposite, effusive and emotionally present in ways that had not ultimately translated into stability. Ethan had spent years trying to locate the right position between those 2 points, and was not certain he'd found it. He put this thought where he put thoughts that weren't immediately actionable, and went back to the Line 4 assessment documents. The Blackstone Line 4 assessment work started in the second week of January, scheduled around the Vantech ramp milestones exactly as he'd planned. He was at Blackstone 3 days in the first 2 weeks. Not for maintenance, but for the engineering assessment, which was a different kind of presence in the facility. He had access to the full technical documentation for the Line 4 upgrade, the equipment specifications, the installation timeline proposed by the primary contractor. He read through all of it, and then read through it again before he said anything to anyone. On the 3rd day, he submitted a preliminary findings memo to Devin's email. It was 8 pages. It identified, in careful and documented sequence, 4 areas in the proposed installation design where the contractor's specifications created foreseeable failure risks. Not certain failures, not guaranteed problems, but vulnerabilities that the standard installation approach didn't account for given the specific operating conditions of Blackstone's facility. 2 of the 4 were minor, 1 was moderate, 1 was significant. Devin forwarded it to Victoria the same day it arrived. Victoria read it that evening. The significant finding was in the control system integration design. Specifically, the way the proposed upgrade integrated the new Line 4 control network with the existing primary line infrastructure. The contractor's design treated them as effectively independent systems with a shared data interface. Ethan's analysis identified a condition under which a failure event in one system could, through the shared interface, trigger a cascade into the other under specific load conditions that occurred roughly twice per week during peak production cycles. In practical terms, if the Line 4 upgrade was installed as designed and the specific load condition occurred during a failure event, it was possible to lose both Line 4 and the primary line simultaneously. She read this section 3 times. Then she called Devin, who was still at the office, and said, "Get me the installation contractor's engineering lead on the phone tomorrow morning, and get Carter in here." Devin said, "He has a scheduled Vantech delivery coordination call tomorrow morning." "When is he free?" "He said he could do early afternoon, 1 o'clock. 1 o'clock. The meeting the following afternoon was in the main conference room with Victoria, Kevin Marsh, Richard Sloan from operations, the Blackstone internal engineering coordinator, whose name was James, and Ethan, who arrived at 12:58 with the printed assessment memo and a second document he'd prepared that morning, a revised integration design that addressed the significant finding. He hadn't been asked for a revised design. The scope of the assessment contract was to identify issues, not solve them. He'd done the revision because the solution was clear and straightforward, and sitting in front of him and leaving it on the table would have been, he thought about the word Victoria had used to him once, inaccurate. He set both documents on the table when he sat down. Victoria looked at the second document. "This wasn't in the scope." "No," he said, "but the fix is straightforward and I had time." Kevin Marsh picked up the revised design document and looked at it for a moment. He said something under his breath that Ethan didn't catch, and then put it back down. The meeting ran 90 minutes. Most of it was Ethan walking through the findings in sequence, answering James's technical questions. And there were good questions. James was clearly competent, and the conversation between them had the quality of two people who understood the same language using it properly, and addressing Sloan's operational concerns about timeline impact. The timeline impact of the significant finding was real. The contractor's installation schedule would need to be revised. Depending on how much of the design needed rework, it could add 3 to 6 weeks to the Line 4 upgrade timeline. "What's the exposure if we proceed with the original design?" Sloan asked. Ethan looked at him. "The specific load condition that triggers the cascade risk happens during peak production cycles. How often do you have failure events during peak cycles?" Sloan looked at James. James pulled up a maintenance log on his tablet. He scrolled for a moment. "In the last 18 months, 6 times. 6 failure events during peak cycles in 18 months, Ethan said. With the original design, each of those events carries a probability of cascading to the primary line. The probability per event is not high. The cumulative risk over time is significant." "What's the probability per event?" Victoria asked. "Somewhere between 8 and 14%, depending on the specific failure type. I can give you the range, but not a precise number without more information about the failure types." 8 to 14%, 6 times in 18 months. Everyone in the room was doing the math. "Revise the design," Victoria said. Sloan said, "The contractor will revise the design." She said it in the tone that meant the decision was made. "James, work with Ethan on the revised integration specifications. Get them to the contractor by end of week." The meeting ended. People gathered documents and phones and moved toward the door, and Ethan was repacking his copies when Victoria said, from across the table, "You said you had time." He looked up. "For the revised design. You said you had time." She was watching him with the precise, evaluating attention he'd come to recognize as her version of genuine interest. "You're running a manufacturing expansion, a Vantech ramp, and the Blackstone assessment. Where is the time?" He thought about it honestly. "I don't sleep a lot. That's not sustainable." "I know." He closed his folder. "I'm hiring a quality coordinator next month. That moves 2 hours a day back to me. And Paul is ready to take on more of the daily production oversight. I'm building toward not being the single point of failure for everything." "Are you there yet?" "No," he said without hesitation. She nodded once. At least you know it. He drove back to Carter Industrial in the early afternoon light, which in January was the low-angle kind that made everything look longer than it was. Shadows stretching across parking lots, the road ahead carrying more sky than usual. The meeting had gone well, which he'd expected. The findings were solid, the revised design was correct, James had been a competent counterpart, and Victoria had made decisions quickly and in the right direction. It was a well-run meeting, the kind that left him with less work rather than more. What he hadn't fully anticipated was the moment at the end when she'd asked about his time, not as a management observation, as something else, a question from a person who'd noticed something and was asking about it directly. He hadn't known what to do with that entirely, so he'd answered it the only way he knew how, which was honestly, and she'd responded to the honesty the way she always did, with her own form of it. It was a strange thing, he thought, the way trust built between people who had started from a point of fundamental misrecognition. Not quickly, not smoothly, not with the rough edges sanded off, but genuinely because the alternative was continuing to relate to each other through the initial error, and neither of them, it turned out, was willing to do that indefinitely. Roberto was in the bay when he got back, running a diagnostic on a client's conveyor system. Carter's mechanicals still operated, still took service jobs, with Roberto managing the shop day-to-day, while Ethan's attention had largely migrated to the mill. It was a division of labor that had evolved without either of them formally deciding on it, the way functional divisions sometimes did. Roberto looked up when he came in. How was Blackstone? Good. Productive. She was there again? Roberto had not been told specifically about Victoria's pattern of appearing during Ethan's Blackstone visits, but Roberto paid attention and drew reasonable conclusions. She was there, Ethan said. Roberto returned to the conveyor diagnostic. After a moment, he said, Is she still treating you like the repair shop guy? Ethan thought about the conference room, the assessment meeting, the question about his time. Not really, he said. What happened? She read the audit report. Roberto considered this. That's all it took? A report? The report had accurate information in it. He picked up the messages that had come in during the afternoon. 2 from clients, 1 from the Riverside Community College contact about the upcoming hiring cohort, 1 from Linda with a question about the Vantech contract extension terms. People update their models when the information is clear, and they're the kind of people who update their models. And she is. Yes. What about the people who aren't? Roberto asked. Ethan sorted the messages by urgency. You deal with those differently. How? You work around them when you can, and you stop working with them when you can't. He picked up the phone to call Linda back. It's not complicated. Roberto made the sound he made when he thought something was more complicated than Ethan was representing it. Ethan let this stand because Roberto was occasionally right about that, and called Linda. The Blackstone Line 4 revised design went to the contractor Thursday. The contractor's engineering lead pushed back on 2 points, which James forwarded to Ethan for technical review. Ethan responded to both with documented analysis. 1 point the contractor was right about, 1 they were wrong about, and he said so about each of them without equivocation. The contractor accepted the response on the 2nd point, pushed back again on the 1st, and after a 2nd round of documentation review, agreed on revised language for both. James sent Ethan a message at the end of this process that said, First time I've seen them revise their own spec twice in one engagement. Just wanted to note that. Ethan replied the first revision was theirs. They were right about it. James replied, I know. That's the part I'm noting. He filed the correspondence and went back to the Vantech production schedule. The February equipment installation at Carter Industrial ran 11 days instead of the projected 9. The delay was in the electrical connection work, not a design problem, a scheduling problem with the electrical subcontractor who'd had a crew injury on another site and had to pull 2 people to cover. Ethan had built 4 days of buffer into the installation timeline. He used 2 of them. The 3rd machining center came online on a Thursday afternoon. Paul ran the initial calibration sequence with the focused attention of someone who'd learned to care about 0.003 millimeters. Dario watched from his station with the particular stillness of someone who was investing in the outcome without wanting to make it weird. The calibration came in clean on the first run. Ethan looked at the readout. He looked at Paul. Good, he said. Paul said, Same thing you said about the first one. It's the same situation. You could expand the vocabulary slightly. The vocabulary is accurate, Ethan said. If it had been excellent, I would have said excellent. What would excellent look like? Faster than expected, tighter than specified, and zero thermal drift over the first 4-hour cycle. Paul nodded, accepting the rubric. I'll try for excellent next time. You'll try for it every time, Ethan said. That's the job. He went back to his office and updated the project list. 140 items as of October. He was now at 87. Not because the list was getting shorter. Items came off it as they were completed, and new items went on as the work produced new requirements. But because the rate of completion had accelerated as the team had grown and the processes had matured. 87 items. He looked at them. Linda called that evening, while he was helping Lily with a school project that involved cutting out shapes from colored paper, which meant Lily was doing the cutting and he was handing her the scissors and holding the paper steady in the way she'd determined was the correct distribution of labor. The Vantech extension terms, Linda said. I've reviewed the proposed language. There's one clause about exclusivity in the component class that I want to talk through. Exclusivity is a no, he said. Lily said, Hold the paper, Daddy. He held the paper with his phone between his shoulder and ear, which was not ergonomically ideal. That's what I thought, Linda said. How firm? Firm. I'm not locking Carter Industrial into a single customer dependency at this stage of the build. Vantech is a strong relationship. They're not the only relationship we're going to have. They'll push on it. I know. The counteroffer is a preferred supplier designation with a volume commitment tier. That gets them what they actually want, which is supply chain reliability, without giving them exclusivity. He handed Lily the scissors. I'll write up the counteroffer language tonight. Tonight meaning after the craft project. Lily said, It's not a craft project, it's a science project. After the science project, Linda said. After the science project, he confirmed. He put the phone down and looked at what Lily was making, which appeared to be a model of the solar system using colored circles that were not quite in the right relative scale, but were arranged with genuine attention to order. Which one is that? He asked, pointing to an orange circle. Saturn, she said with absolute confidence. Where are the rings? She looked at Saturn. She looked at the scissors. She picked up a yellow strip of paper and cut it into a curved shape that she applied to the circle with a small piece of tape. There, she said. He looked at Saturn with its slightly lopsided ring system. Good, he said. She looked at him with the expression she'd developed recently for when he used that particular word. Is it excellent? He looked at it again, thinking about the rubric he'd given Paul. Faster than expected, tighter than specified, zero thermal drift. The ring is faster than expected, he said. I'll give you that one. She seemed satisfied with this and went back to work, and he held the paper, and the evening continued in the way that evenings continued. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but forward, which was the direction that mattered. Outside, the February night was doing what February nights did in this city, which was to make the inside feel smaller and warmer than it actually was. The lights Lily had strung on the curtain rod in the kitchen, left over from December because she'd decided they should stay up, reflected in the window against the dark outside. 87 items on the list, a third machining center running clean, a Vantech counteroffer to write, a Blackstone Line 4 revised design in the hands of a contractor who'd revised their own specs twice, which James had apparently found noteworthy. He thought about what Roberto had asked. What happened? She read the audit report. It was true as far as it went. But it was also true that the audit report had only mattered because Victoria Langford was the kind of person who, when confronted with accurate information, changed course. He'd met people who weren't. He'd worked for some of them years ago, before he'd understood that the quality of the environment was part of the calculation. The relationship was not simple. It was probably not going to become simple. Two people who had started from a point of misrecognition and were building something more accurate out of the corrected information. That didn't resolve into easy. It resolved into honest, which was a different thing. Honest was enough to work with. Lily stuck Saturn to the paper solar system with the finality of someone completing the most important component and looked up at him. "Done," she said. He looked at the solar system. 8 planets, roughly in order, not quite to scale. Saturn with its improvised ring, all of it laid out on a sheet of construction paper with the particular confidence of someone who had committed fully to the project. "Looks right to me," he said. She started putting the cap back on the markers, one by one, with careful attention to matching caps to colors. He picked up his phone to start on the Vantech counteroffer language. The work continued, as it always did, in the spaces between everything else. The Vantech counteroffer went back on a Wednesday. Ethan had written the language Tuesday night, after the solar system project was packed away and Lily was asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with the lights she'd left up on the curtain rod casting the room in a warm yellow that was better for thinking than he'd expected. The preferred supplier designation with the volume commitment tier. He'd structured it carefully, not just as a negotiating position, but as something genuinely better for both parties than exclusivity would have been. Exclusivity would have given Vantech a lock on his capacity. The tiered structure gave them priority access and pricing advantages at higher volume levels, which incentivized them to grow the relationship rather than simply protect it. The distinction mattered. A client who was incentivized to grow with you was a different kind of client than one who'd bought a fence around you. Linda had reviewed the language at 7 in the morning and sent back 2 minor edits and a note that said, "This is better than what they proposed. They should take it. They took it in 4 days." The procurement director called Linda directly, which was unusual, and said they'd accept the tiered structure and drop the exclusivity clause. He also said, which Linda relayed to Ethan verbatim, that their supply chain team had described Carter Industrial's quality consistency as the best new domestic supplier relationship we've added in 3 years. Ethan received this information, filed it in the appropriate place in his brain, and went to the production floor to check on the 3rd machining center's first full-cycle performance data. The data was clean, not excellent by his rubric. The thermal drift in the 4th hour was within specification, but higher than the first 2 units ran, but clean and consistent and documentable. He wrote up the observation, flagged the thermal drift for monitoring, and added an item to his list about calibrating the temperature compensation against the specific heat profile of the north end of the facility in winter. 86 items. March came in the way March did in this part of the country, with the pretense of spring followed by a week of cold that reminded everyone that pretense was not a climate. The Carter Industrial production floor had its own thermal environment by this point, 3 machining centers, and the support equipment generating enough ambient heat that the workers had stopped wearing their heavier layers by mid-morning most days. He'd hired 2 people from the Riverside Community College program in February. Their names were Sandra, not his neighbor Sandra, a different Sandra, which had initially caused mild confusion in conversation, and a young man named Terrence, who was 22 and had the specific combination of theoretical training and uncertainty about how to apply it that Ethan recognized as the best possible starting point. You could teach application. You couldn't teach the theoretical foundation to someone who decided they already knew enough. The quality coordinator position had gone to a woman named Priya Desai, who had 8 years at a medical device manufacturer and the kind of meticulous documentation standards that made Ethan's own documentation look casual by comparison. He'd known she was right for the role in the first 20 minutes of the interview when she'd asked him 3 questions about his current quality protocol that identified the 2 areas he'd been meaning to formalize and hadn't yet. He'd said during the interview, "You just identified the 2 weakest points in the current system." She'd said, "I know, that's why I'm asking." He'd offered her the position before she left the building. With Priya handling quality coordination and Paul taking on daily production oversight, Ethan's time redistributed in the way he'd told Victoria it would. Not cleanly, not all at once, but in the gradual way that structural changes happened when they were based on real capability development rather than optimistic delegation. He was sleeping more than he had been in the fall. Not enough, probably, by any objective standard, but more. Roberto noticed. "You look less dead," he said one morning at the shop, which was Roberto's version of a compliment. "Thanks." "Dario says the mill is running well." "It's running well," Ethan agreed. "He also says the young one, Terrence, is going to be good." Terrence is going to be very good. He doesn't know it yet, which is fine. He'll figure it out. Roberto handed him a coffee. The shop had acquired an actual coffee maker at some point in the past year, replacing the single-serve machine that had been making substandard coffee for 3 years, and said, "My brother-in-law wants a raise." Ethan said, "Tell Dario to come talk to me." "I'm telling you now. Tell him to come talk to me so he can ask me himself, like a person." Roberto looked like he might argue this, then didn't. Fine. Dario came to talk to him that afternoon, which was either evidence of confidence or evidence that Roberto had texted him immediately after the conversation. Ethan gave him a raise. Not what he'd asked for, what the role was worth at the current production volume, which was slightly more than he'd asked for, which briefly confused him. "You're giving me more than I asked," Dario said. "You asked for what you thought was reasonable. I'm giving you what the role is worth." Ethan paused. "Next time, ask for what the role is worth." Dario was quiet for a moment. "How do I know what the role is worth?" "You look at what people in equivalent roles at equivalent facilities are compensated. That's publicly available information. You want me to research my own salary negotiation. I want you to know what you're worth so you can ask for it accurately." He returned to the document he'd been working on. "That's the conversation. You're good." Dario left, and Ethan thought briefly about the version of himself 10 years ago who'd had exactly the same problem. Knowing the work, not knowing the value of the work, and the particular kind of erosion that happened to people who stayed in that gap too long. He'd been lucky. He'd had a mentor at Harland Technologies, a senior engineer named Walt Briggs, who told him once, in the direct and slightly uncomfortable way of someone who'd made the mistake himself, "The work speaks, but you still have to say the number out loud." Walt was retired now, living in Arizona according to the Christmas card that arrived every year with a note in handwriting that was getting slightly less precise. Ethan had sent him a card in December, and had included a photo of Lily and a 1-paragraph update on the mill. Walt had sent back a postcard that said, "Knew you'd get there. Took you long enough." He kept the postcard in the desk drawer under the notebooks. The Line 4 upgrade at Blackstone finished in April, 3 weeks behind the original contractor timeline, 2 weeks ahead of the revised timeline that had accounted for the design rework. The installation ran clean. James sent Ethan an email the day it came online. "Line 4 is up. No anomalies in the first 6-hour test cycle. The control system integration is running exactly as your revised design specified." Ethan replied, "Good. Run a stress cycle at peak load before you sign off on the contractor's completion certification. The cascade risk condition only manifests under specific load parameters." James replied, "Already scheduled it. Tomorrow morning." The stress cycle ran clean. James sent a 2-word email. "Passed. Thanks." Devin followed up later in the day with the formal project closeout communication, which included a note at the bottom that read, "Ms. Langford asked me to let you know that Line 4 project outcome was reviewed at this morning's operations meeting and specifically noted as an example of the value of the expanded vendor relationship." He read this and thought about what it meant, in the context of everything that had led to it. The January night in the parking lot, the dismissal that had been so fast and complete that she probably hadn't been fully aware of it, the vendor review that had questioned whether his company met the revenue threshold, the audit report that had put the accurate picture in front of people who were capable of updating their model when the picture was accurate. He typed back, "Glad it went well. Send me the post-installation monitoring protocol when James has it finalized. I want to make sure the first 90 days of operational data is reviewed against the cascade risk parameters." Devin replied, "Of course." He filed the correspondence and updated the Blackstone project file. The Spring Regional Manufacturing Summit happened in mid-April at the convention center downtown. Ethan went because Linda had said, in the firm tone she used for things she considered non-negotiable, that Carter Industrial was at a stage where industry visibility was a legitimate business interest, and that showing up to the regional summit was the minimum viable version of that visibility. He'd argued briefly that he didn't have time. She'd argued back that he had Priya running quality and Paul running daily production and a Vantech ramp that was on schedule, and that "I don't have time" had become a habit of thought that hadn't caught up with the current operational reality. She was probably right. He didn't say this aloud. He went to the summit in the same dark pants and better jacket he wore to professional meetings, because he didn't own anything that would be described as event attire, and he wasn't going to acquire any. He registered, got a name badge, and spent the first 40 minutes of the morning session in a presentation about regional supply chain resilience that was informative in some sections and excessive in others. During the break, he was standing near the coffee station with a cup he didn't particularly want when Douglas Presser materialized at his elbow. Douglas Presser, who had been at the October industry dinner and had talked about the Harland mill as a white elephant, looked at his name badge and then at him with the expression of someone doing a rapid recalculation. "Carter Industrial," he said. "You're the Harland mill." "That's us," Ethan said. Douglas processed this for a moment. He was a large man with the particular confidence of someone who'd been the most significant operator in most rooms he'd entered for a long time. He was not, Ethan noted, the kind of person who became hostile when recalibrated. He was the kind of person who updated and moved forward, which was the more interesting type. "Vantech supplier agreement," Douglas said. "Heard about it through the association." "You heard fast. I pay attention." He looked at Ethan directly. "I said at the October dinner that building needs a miracle." "I remember." "I was wrong about the building," Douglas said. "I don't like being wrong about buildings. Or anything, but buildings specifically." He said it like a man admitting something he'd practiced admitting and was still not entirely comfortable with. "What did you see that the rest of us missed?" Ethan thought about the 11 site visits before the purchase, the core sampling, the electrical grid analysis, the 18 months of projections stress-tested against multiple downside scenarios. He thought about what the short answer was. "The structural assessment was conservative," he said. "The visible deterioration on the facade affected the conventional assessment more than the actual foundation condition warranted, and the electrical integration problem had a solution that wasn't in the standard restoration playbook. It required custom grid configuration that the conventional contractors wouldn't have proposed." Douglas looked at him. "You designed the electrical integration yourself?" "Yes." "Is that one of the pending patents?" Ethan looked at him. "You did your research." "I said I pay attention." Douglas took a slow drink of his coffee. "I have a facility on the south end of the region that has an infrastructure problem I've been looking at for 2 years. My engineers say it's not solvable at a viable cost. I'm starting to think I should get a second opinion." He paused deliberately. "Specifically from someone whose definition of solvable is apparently different from everyone else's." Ethan said, "Send me the specifications and I'll tell you if there's a solution. If there's not, I'll tell you that too." "You'd tell me honestly if you couldn't solve it?" "I'd tell you honestly what I found. That's the whole service." Douglas studied him for a moment in the way of someone deciding whether they believed a thing they wanted to believe. "All right," he said, "I'll have my people send over the documentation." "CarterIndustrial.com," Ethan said. "There's a contact form." He paused. "It works better than it looks." Douglas laughed. It was a genuine laugh, not a polished one. "Fair enough." They talked for another few minutes, the kind of substantive conversation that happened between people who both understood the technical landscape and were each taking the measure of the other honestly. Then the break ended and they went back to the session, and Ethan sat through the afternoon program with slightly more engagement than he'd expected and drove back to the mill at 4:30. He told no one about the conversation with Douglas. He noted the potential consulting engagement in his calendar as a follow-up item and moved on. The documentation arrived 11 days later. He reviewed it over 2 evenings. The facility problem was real and specific, and the conventional engineering assessment was, as Douglas's people had determined, correct in identifying the challenge, but only within the framework of conventional restoration approaches. There was a non-conventional approach, technically more complex, that the standard playbook didn't contain because it had been developed in the context of Ethan's own patented grid configuration work. He wrote a 12-page analysis. He did not inflate the solution's simplicity or understate the implementation complexity. He said what it was, what it would require, what the realistic cost and timeline looked like, and what the outcome would be if it was executed correctly. He sent it to Douglas with a cover note that said, "There's a solution. It's not simple. Call me when you've read it." Douglas called the next morning. The conversation lasted 47 minutes and covered the technical approach in enough depth that Ethan knew, by the end, that Douglas understood what he was proposing well enough to make a real decision. "I'm going to have my engineering team review this," Douglas said. "Then I want to meet in person." "That's the right process," Ethan said. "If this works—" Douglas paused. "If this works, it's not a small thing. If it works because the engineering is right. Review it carefully and tell me where you think it's wrong. I'd rather find the problems before we commit." Another pause. "You're not selling me anything. I'm giving you an accurate analysis. What you do with it is your decision." Douglas was quiet for a moment that felt less like hesitation and more like he was deciding something. "My engineering team will get back to you within 2 weeks. They got back to him in 9 days. The review found one area where the implementation complexity had been understated, a valid critique, and Ethan revised the analysis to reflect it. The revised analysis came back with a note from Douglas's lead engineer that said, in the flat language of someone who is not in the habit of excessive praise, "Analysis is sound. Recommend proceeding to detailed engineering phase." The detailed engineering engagement with Douglas Presser's facility was added to the Carter Industrial Project list. 83 items now, accounting for the new addition and the 4 that had come off in the past week. It was May. 16 months since the Harland mill purchase closed on a Thursday afternoon in a conference room that smelled like old carpet. 28 months since a production line had gone dark at Blackstone Manufacturing at 11:47 p.m. and Marcus Webb had called a number saved in his personal phone. Ethan stood on the production floor of Carter Industrial on a Tuesday morning and looked at what it was. 3 machining centers running in sequence. The sound of them, the specific, rhythmic sound of precision work being done at correct parameters. Paul at the production oversight station with the focused attention of someone who'd grown into the role rather than been assigned it. Priya in the quality room, visible through the window, reviewing morning inspection data with the same meticulous care she brought to everything. Dario running the second unit with the steady competence of a man who'd found a place where his experience was valued rather than overlooked. Sandra and Terrence, the 2 Riverside graduates, working the third unit, Sandra with the growing confidence of someone realizing that her theoretical training had been right. Terrence with the particular intensity of someone who was beginning to understand that he was actually good at this. It was not a perfect operation. The north end heating was still inconsistent in cold weather. The access road had a section that needed resurfacing. The administrative systems were overbuilt in some areas and underbuilt in others because they'd grown alongside the operation rather than being designed in advance. The 5th item on the project list was a materials management software integration that had been the 5th item on the list for 6 weeks, because every time he was about to address it, something more urgent appeared above it. It was not perfect, it was real and functional, and built by people who were doing the actual work with actual care, which was the version of things that mattered. He went back to his office and called Linda. "The Douglas Presser engagement," he said. "We're moving to detailed engineering. I want to think about whether this becomes a consulting practice line or stays as individual project work." "That's a structural question," Linda said. "I know. I'm asking your read." She was quiet for a moment in the way of someone whose read was already formed and was being verified before sharing. "You have 3 revenue streams right now. Vantech production, Blackstone maintenance and assessment, and now the Douglas consulting project. Those are 3 different kinds of work that require 3 different kinds of management attention. At some point, if the consulting grows, you either build a team around it or it eats the rest of your capacity. So you're saying it needs to be a separate practice with its own structure or it doesn't scale. I'm saying if 3 projects like Douglas appear in the next year, which seems possible, you'll need more than yourself to run them. So yes." He thought about this. Thought about Walt Briggs's Christmas card postcard, the "took you long enough." Thought about what Walt had actually meant by that, which was not just the mill, but the long arc of what Ethan had been building towards since Harmon Technologies closed, and he'd found himself standing outside the building with a box of personal items, wondering what the point had been of being very good at something in a context that had decided to eliminate the context. He'd spent 3 years in the repair shop learning, in the specific way that you learn things by doing them, that the work itself was the point. Not the institution, not the company name on the building, not the revenue tier of the client, the work. And the work, it turned out, didn't care about any of those things. It cared whether you showed up and paid attention and did it correctly. Build the consulting structure, he told Linda. I'll need help thinking through the staffing model. I'll put together some options, she said. Give me 2 weeks. Good. He put the phone down and opened his email. There was a message from Devin that had come in that morning, which he hadn't read yet. He opened it. Ms. Langford would like to know if you have availability for a meeting in the next 2 weeks. Not a scheduled maintenance visit, a separate conversation. She said you'll know the general subject matter. Please let me know your availability. He read this twice. He thought about what the general subject matter was likely to be, given the trajectory of the past several months. The Line 4 outcome, the audit report and its aftermath, the expanded scope that was working, the consulting work with Douglas that was now presumably not invisible in an industry where information moved through relationship networks. He thought about what kind of meeting Victoria Langford requested through Devin with a note that said, you'll know the general subject matter, a partnership conversation, some version of it. He sat with this for a moment, not with anxiety, not with particular excitement, but with the careful attention he gave to things that deserved it. He wrote back, available Thursday of next week, afternoon, or the following Monday morning. Either works. Devin confirmed Thursday at 2 o'clock. He told Linda, who said, partnership conversation? Probably. Do you want me there? Not for the first conversation. If something concrete develops, yes. What's your read on what she's going to propose? He thought about Victoria Langford. Not the parking lot version, not the operations center version, but the version he'd come to know through 9 months of working interactions. The person who read his maintenance notes and asked Devin to route them to her directly, who showed up for conversations she could have delegated, who'd said something true and difficult to his face in a corridor and hadn't softened it. I don't know the specific terms yet, he said, but the conversation will be honest. That much I know. He spent the days between the email and the Thursday meeting the way he spent most days, working because the work was what there was, and because the work was also what he was, in the way that things you've chosen deeply become part of the structure of yourself. He ran the Vantech production schedule review with Priya and found one area where the documentation protocol needed tightening before the next client audit. He reviewed the first phase of the Douglas Presser detailed engineering analysis and made 3 substantive revisions. He did the Blackstone monthly maintenance report. He picked Lily up from school on Tuesday and Thursday, which were his days, and on Tuesday she told him at length about a disagreement with her best friend Maya that seemed to have originated from a dispute about the correct color of a fictional horse. And on Thursday she told him the disagreement was resolved because they'd decided the horse was 2 colors, which satisfied both positions. That's a good solution, he said. I know, she said. I thought of it. Did Maya agree it was your idea? A pause. We both thought of it, she said, with the particular revision of someone who'd decided accuracy was more important than credit. He drove and thought that was probably the most important lesson of the whole story, and said nothing about it, because some things were better when people arrived at them themselves. On Thursday morning, before the Blackstone meeting, he was at the mill at 7. He walked the production floor the way he did most mornings, not with a checklist, just looking, the 20-minute version of the thing he'd done in every industrial space he'd ever cared about, listening to what the machines were saying in the way machines communicated, which was through variation and trend and the small deviations from baseline that meant something if you'd been paying attention long enough. Everything was running. He stood in the middle of the floor for a moment with his coffee, which had already gone slightly cold because he'd been holding it too long. The morning light was coming through the east windows at the angle that he'd stopped noticing was cinematic, because now it was just the morning light in his building. Terrence was setting up his station. He looked up, saw Ethan, and gave the brief nod of someone who'd learned that Ethan's morning walk wasn't an inspection that required performance, just a man looking at his floor. Ethan nodded back and went to his office. He got to Blackstone at 1:55. Devin met him in reception, not unusual. But she also said, she asked me to bring you up directly, which was, in 2 years of interactions, the first time that phrase had occurred. Victoria's office was on the 4th floor, corner position, 2 walls of windows. He'd never been in it before. It was, he noted, not a decorated office. No industry awards on the walls, no motivational statements, no staged photographs. The desk was organized in the functional way of someone who worked at it rather than used it for appearances. The window behind it looked out over the city, which in May was the greenest it got, the trees on the street below in full leaf. She was at the desk when Devon brought him in, and she stood, which was a formality he noted without making much of. "Thanks for coming," she said. "Of course." She gestured to the chairs at the side table, which was where she apparently had conversations that weren't across the desk, and they sat. She didn't have a preamble. He'd come to expect this. "I want to propose a formal partnership between Blackstone and Carter Industrial," she said. "Not a vendor relationship, a structural partnership. Joint engineering development on precision manufacturing process improvement, shared IP on any innovations developed through the collaboration, and a long-term supply and services agreement that covers both the maintenance and assessment work and production capacity from Carter Industrial for specific component classes." He looked at her. "I'll have our legal team prepare a term sheet if you want to proceed to that stage," she said. "But I wanted to have this conversation first, without the lawyers in the room, to know if it's worth the term sheet." He said, "What does shared IP mean, specifically? Because I have existing IP that doesn't share." "The existing patents are yours. What I'm proposing is joint ownership of any IP developed through collaborative work under the partnership agreement. New innovations, jointly developed. Define the collaboration boundary," he said. "If I'm doing work for Carter Industrial clients that happens to benefit from thinking I've developed through Blackstone collaboration, I need clarity on what belongs where." She nodded. She'd expected this. The boundary is the specific projects and personnel designated as joint development. Work you do independently, on your own clients, with your own methodology, is yours. This is about creating a defined collaborative space, not claiming what you bring to it. "That's the right structure," he said. "I'll need to review the term sheet carefully, specifically the joint development designation process, and how we resolve disagreements about what falls inside or outside the boundary." "Understood." "And the supply agreement terms need to be staged, consistent with Carter Industrial's expansion timeline. I'm not committing to production volumes that outpace my proven capacity." "Also understood." She paused. "Is there anything in the concept itself that doesn't work for you? Before we get to terms." He thought about this honestly. The honest answer was no. The concept was sound. The structure she'd described was the right structure, and the combination of engineering collaboration and production supply represented a relationship that could benefit both organizations if the terms were right. But he also thought about something else, about the nature of what was being built here and whether it was being built on solid ground. "I want to say something," he said. She waited. "The reason I'm willing to have this conversation isn't the Line 4 project or the Vantic agreement or anything in the Prescott audit report," he said. "It's that in the time we've been working together, I've found you to be honest, directly honest, even when it's uncomfortable. The conversation in the production corridor in November, you said something difficult and you said it straight." He paused. "That's the thing I can work with. The business terms matter, but they're not the foundation. The foundation is whether the people involved tell the truth. I believe you do." She looked at him for a moment with the expression that he'd come to understand meant she was actually processing what he'd said rather than formulating a response. "That's a generous read of what I said in November," she said. "It's an accurate read. I told you I'd made an error in judgment. You told me directly, without hedging, without making it about external circumstances, and without asking for anything in return for saying it." He held her gaze. "That's not a small thing. Most people can't do it." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the city went about its Thursday afternoon business. "I looked at a man in a parking lot and decided what he was in 3 seconds, she said, "and I was wrong. And the reason I was wrong wasn't bad information. It was that I looked at the truck and the toolbox and made the assessment before I'd seen anything real." She paused. "I've spent my career believing I could read situations fast, and that speed was an asset. That one cost me." "It cost us both some time," he said, "not irreparably." No. She looked at him. Not irreparably. They sat with that for a moment, the two of them, in an office on a Thursday afternoon with the May light coming through the windows and the city going on below them. Two people who had started from a wrong beginning and had found their way to a right middle and were now deciding together what the next part looked like. He asked 3 more specific questions about the proposed structure. She answered all 3 directly. He identified 2 areas where the initial concept needed adjustment and explained why, and she listened with the attention of someone who was actually revising rather than waiting to defend. By the end of the hour, they had a clear enough picture of the shape of the thing that the term sheet could be useful rather than just an opening position. "I'll have legal prepare it," she said. "Send it to Linda Cho," he said. "I know who Linda is." He almost smiled at that. "I know you do." He drove back to Carter Industrial in the late afternoon, the May light doing the long shadow thing again, and thought about what had just happened, and what it meant, and what he was going to do with it. The answer to what he was going to do with it was careful due diligence on the term sheet, a thorough conversation with Linda, a structural review of Carter Industrial's capacity to support the partnership obligations, and then a decision based on the actual terms and the actual numbers. That was the answer to the practical question. The other question, the one underneath the practical one, was harder to articulate, and he didn't try to while driving, because driving required attention, and the question was the kind that got worse when you rushed it. He picked up Lily at Sandra's. She was in the middle of something that involved several colored pencils and a sheet of paper, and the absolute focus of someone mid-project, and she said, without looking up, 5 more minutes. He sat on Sandra's couch and waited. Sandra came in from the kitchen with a cup of coffee she handed to him without asking because she'd learned his habits over years of this arrangement, and said, "Good day?" "Productive," he said. She'd learned not to ask for more than that, which was one of her many excellent qualities. Lily finished in 3 minutes and 40 seconds, which suggested 5 minutes had been approximate. She showed him the drawing, a house, the recognizable representation of their house, with the porch swing and the rain boots by the door and a flag on top. "The factory has a flag," he said. "This is different," she said. "This is the house flag, so people can find us too." He looked at her. She was 7 years old, with colored pencil on her hands and her mother's eyes, and his stubborn precision in the way she'd drawn the porch swing at exactly the right proportion to the door, and the absolute certainty of someone who had decided that the important places should be findable. "That's a good idea," he said. "I know," she said. She put the drawing in her backpack with the particular care she gave to things she intended to keep. They walked home. 3 blocks, the route she'd memorized within a month of starting at this school, and now navigated with the proprietary confidence of someone who owns a geography. She told him about the horse resolution again, the 2-color solution, this time with additional detail about the exact colors involved and why each was appropriate for a different aspect of the horse. He listened. He asked 2 questions that were genuine, and she answered them with the thoroughness they deserved. They made dinner. He burned one edge of the grilled cheese because he was thinking about the partnership term sheet, and she pointed this out with the directness of someone who had strong opinions about burned edges, and he trimmed it, and she accepted the trimmed version. After dinner, after the dishes, after the reading that she'd made into a 20-minute minimum requirement through extended discussion of each page, after she was in bed and he'd had the conversation about the window shade position that was a nightly negotiation with its own established protocol. After all of it, he sat at the kitchen table with the legal pad and a pen and started writing down his questions for Linda. He wrote for 40 minutes. 14 questions, some with sub-questions, covering the IP boundary definition, the production capacity commitment structure, the dispute resolution mechanism, the exit provisions, the definition of joint development in operational terms. He looked at the list. Then he wrote something at the top of the page that wasn't a legal question, just something he was thinking, the way he sometimes wrote things down when they needed to be outside his head before he could assess them properly. The work is what it is regardless of who's watching. He sat with it. The past 2 years had not changed what the work was. He'd fixed the same kind of problems, thought through the same kind of engineering challenges, paid the same kind of attention to systems that other people had stopped paying attention to. The mill was the same building it had been when everyone else called it a white elephant. The J7 relay panel failure mode was the same technical reality it had been before any audit report existed. The quality of a machine component was determined by the calibration of the equipment and the attention of the operator, not by the size of the company doing the calibrating. What had changed was the context in which the work occurred. The relationships, the recognition, the infrastructure that would allow the work to grow beyond what one person carrying a toolbox could do alone. Those things mattered. He wasn't so determinedly non-sentimental that he'd pretend otherwise. It mattered that Paul and Dario and Priya and Sandra and Terrence had jobs that were real and worth having. It mattered that Vantech had a domestic supplier they could rely on. It mattered that the Line 4 upgrade at Blackstone was running without the cascade risk that would have eventually and expensively manifested itself. It mattered that Douglas Presser was going to have a solution to an infrastructure problem he'd been stuck on for 2 years. Those were real things. And underneath them, or maybe alongside them, there was the other thing. The thing that was harder to name, and that he'd thought about in various forms since the night he'd restarted Blackstone's primary production line and driven home in the dark and sat in the truck for a moment before going inside. The work was not about proving something. It never had been. He hadn't bought the Harland mill to demonstrate anything to anyone. He hadn't fixed the Blackstone line to earn recognition that hadn't been offered. He'd done those things because the problems existed and the solutions were knowable, and he was the person who knew them. The recognition, when it came, was not the point. But it was not nothing either. It was what happened when accurate information reached people who were capable of using it, and the capable people made better decisions, and the better decisions produced better outcomes, and the better outcomes were real in the world in ways that a person in a parking lot at midnight with a second-hand toolbox could walk away from and know, with certainty, that the thing was actually fixed. That was what you got to keep at the end of it. Not the acknowledgement. The knowledge that the thing was actually fixed. He put the pen down. Outside, the street was quiet. The porch swing was still not repaired, which had been on his personal list for, he thought about it, 14 months now. It was technically functional, the repair, a matter of replacing 2 bolts and reinforcing a bracket that had worked loose. He'd done more complicated things before breakfast on most mornings of the past year and a half. He went out to the porch. The evening was cool, but not cold, the May version of cool, with the smell of things growing in it. He looked at the porch swing, then went to the small storage cabinet by the door that held a selection of basic tools he kept accessible for exactly this kind of thing. He had the swing repaired in 22 minutes. Clean fix, reinforced bracket, both bolts replaced with ones that were the right grade for an outdoor application. He tested it. He sat on it. The chain made a small sound under his weight. The swing moved slightly, the kind of slight movement that meant structurally sound and properly hung. He sat there in the May evening with the neighborhood going quietly around him, the houses with their lights, the street with its parked cars and its trees, the sky doing its late spring thing with the last of the light. He thought about Lily's flag drawing, the one in her backpack, the house flag so people could find them. He thought about the factory drawing, still on the kitchen counter after months, the flag on top so people could find it. He thought about all of it, the mill, the machines, the contracts, the conversations, the people he'd hired and the work they were doing, the partnership term sheet that was being prepared, the Douglas consulting engagement, the Blackstone maintenance reports that had gone from routine documentation to something that meant something different now. And underneath all of it, the thing that had been true from the beginning and was still true. A broken thing just needs someone to pay attention. He'd paid attention. Everything else had followed from that, in the way that things followed when the foundation was correct. Not smoothly, not without setbacks, not without the burned edges and the 14-month pending items and the 0.003 millimeter variance that required a 6-hour recalibration. Real, which meant imperfect, which meant built to last precisely because it hadn't pretended to be anything it wasn't. The Linda conversation would happen. The term sheet would be reviewed. The partnership would be negotiated carefully and structured right, or it wouldn't happen at all, because there was no version of this where he signed his name to terms he hadn't examined thoroughly. And tomorrow morning he'd be at the mill at 7, walking the production floor with the cold coffee and the morning light through the east windows. And Paul would be setting up his station, and Priya would be in the quality room, and the machines would be doing what well-calibrated machines did, which was run. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, if he was being precise about it, exactly what he'd been building toward. He stayed on the swing a while longer until the last of the light was gone, and the street was doing its nighttime thing, and the stars were out in the way they were out in this part of the city, partial, interrupted by the ambient light, but there. Then he went inside, checked that the door was locked, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. He slept.